Hello everyone, very good morning and welcome to Byju's Exam Prep. Welcome back to our discussion on international relations. So in the last class, we were left with a few small topics. So today, we shall try to wrap up these topics and completely cover the syllabus for international relations. Before I start, just let me know if I'm audible, if the video is clearly visible. Just let me know in the comments so that we can get started with the class. Great, everything looks good. So today we shall begin our discussion by talking about India's relations with Russia. If you remember in the last class, we had covered India's relations with another big superpower, which is the United States. We understood India's ties with the US in complete detail. Similarly, we shall understand India's ties with another major global power, that is Russia. By now, we've already had a lot of discussion regarding India's ties with the Soviet Union during the Soviet era. We've understood what kind of relations we had with the Soviet Union during the Cold War period. So let us just summarize this. Let's look at the history, the background briefly, and talk about the current state of relations and the current areas of cooperation and issues between India and Russia. If you look at India-Soviet relations, in the beginning, especially from 1947 to 1971, I would call this the first phase of India-Soviet relations. Why? Because during this Cold War period, when the Cold War was going on, when the world was divided between the two superpowers, that is US and Soviet Union, India chose to remain non-aligned. This is something we have studied repeatedly in previous chapters. In the initial years, India was committed to the principle of non-alignment. We were one of the founding fathers of the non-aligned movement. So until 1971, we did not choose firmly between US or Soviet Union. We adopted a middle path, a neutral path, and this was a deliberate choice made by India because we wrote the principle of strategic autonomy. India's foreign policy was based on the principle of strategic autonomy. It essentially meant that our interests are best served when we remain independent in our foreign policy. We shouldn't be listening to any other power. We shouldn't become allies of any other country. We shouldn't be joining military clubs, contributing to more tensions in the world. So India was against this approach, so we followed an independent foreign policy based on the principle of strategic autonomy. So we resisted the pressure from the US to join the democratic capitalist Western Bloc. Similarly, we didn't entirely align with the Eastern Bloc as well. We didn't become allied with the Soviet Union and the communist socialist ideology. Even though India was non-aligned, the Soviet Union became a good friend of India. The Soviet Union never pushed India to join the Soviet club, like the Americans were doing. We studied in the last class how the US was pressurizing India to join the Western Bloc, to join the democratic countries. But Soviet Union understood India's neutral position, why India is taking the neutral path, and Soviet Union would never pressurize or force India initially to join the Soviet bloc. Even though India was not aligned, the Soviet Union would establish a cordial relationship with India. Not just with India, in fact, with most of the third world countries. These were countries which were recently becoming independent, right? They were just gaining independence from colonial rule. All these were very poor, underdeveloped countries. So the third world countries got assistance from the Soviet Union. This was actually Soviet strategy as well. A strategy of the Soviet Union to win the favor of the third world countries, to keep them away from the American power bloc. So Soviet Union reached out to India, and from the very beginning, we had a strong ideological connection. In fact, part of our freedom struggle was indeed inspired by some of the values and principles of the Soviet polity. If you look at our constitution, for example, you will find a lot of socialist principles that are imbibed into our constitution. Even during our freedom struggle, several freedom fighters of India, including the first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose, right, and the likes of many other freedom fighters of India, they were inspired by the Russian Revolution. They were inspired by the Russian model of planned development, the model of planned development which you study in economy, the 5-year plans. This is something that the Soviet Union had adopted. Right? Soviet Union as a communist state had adopted the socialist principles of welfare and development. That is something that inspired India's leadership. It inspired our freedom struggle as well. It inspired our constitution as well. So there is that common link that you find. There is a link between pre-independent India and Soviet Union and post-independent India and Soviet Union. This led to a strong and close relationship, and especially Soviet Union became a all-weather friend for India from the very beginning. It became an all-weather friend. It gave unconditional support to India on certain critical matters. When the Kashmir conflict broke out with Pakistan, Soviet Union backed India's position. Without questions asked, without any conditions, the Soviet Union gave complete diplomatic support to India, especially at the United Nations. The same would happen again when India annexed and occupied Goa after fighting a brief war with Portugal. I'm sure some of you would be shocked. Yes, we did fight a war with Portugal, a very short, brief conflict, because Portugal was not giving up Goa. Until 1960, India waited, but Portugal was not ready to give up its colony. It was through armed action, it was through military action that the then Indian government captured Goa. We annexed Goa into Indian territory. The situation was so bad that Portugal cut off ties with India. And since Portugal was a major European power, it got the support of all the Western countries, all the European countries, and they actually started putting pressure on India. At this point, it was Soviet Union which supported India at the UN. At the UN, Portugal got the support of United Kingdom, France, and other European countries. So they were all putting pressure on India when India was annexing Goa. But Soviet Union gave complete support to India and helped in the annexation of Goa. So right from the very beginning, on such key issues, Soviet Union started displaying a strategic partnership with India, helping out India on key issues at key platforms. In 1962, when the India-China war broke out, Soviet Union took a neutral position. Now imagine the significance of this. China is a communist state. China was firmly aligned with the Soviet Union. And yet, Soviet Union chose a neutral path even though India was non-aligned. During the India-China conflict, the border war of 1962, Soviet Union took a neutral position, neither backing India nor China. That itself was a great gesture, showing that Soviet Union wanted close, friendly relations with India. So these were some initial events that happened post-independence that laid the foundation for a strong India-Soviet relationship. But the final push came in 1971. 1971 was a turning point for India. But even before that, Soviet Union had started giving some military assistance. In 1960s, after the 62 war, India was desperately looking to modernize its armed forces. The lack of preparedness on our part was one of the reasons why India suffered. But the final push came in 1971. 1971 was a turning point for India. But even before that, Soviet Union had started giving some military assistance. In 1960s, after the 62 war, India was desperately looking to modernize its armed forces. The lack of preparedness on our part was one of the reasons why India suffered a humiliating crushing defeat against China in 1962. This is something we had studied in our previous chapter under India-China relations. So after the war, India started to modernize its armed forces, and Soviet Union became the supplier of essential military weapons and military equipment to India. The MiG series of fighter jets that we still operate even today, right? They were Soviet origin. The MiG-21 at that point in 1962 was one of the most advanced fighter jets, and Soviet Union was ready to sell this to India to give India an edge over China. Previously, the same fighter jets had been denied to China, but now Soviet Union was willing to sell them to India, and it went on to become the backbone of the Indian Air Force for several decades. We procured all the series of MiGs, right? Not just MiG-21. We had the MiG-29, the MiG-23s. There were different variants under MiG-21 itself. So over the next 40 to 50 years, the MiG fighter jets would become the backbone of the Indian Air Force. In 1965, when the India-Pakistan war happened, I had explained previously how Soviet Union helped in mediating the Tashkent Agreement, which brought the war to an end. Soviet Union acted as a neutral mediator at Tashkent. Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri and his Pakistani counterpart, they both met and worked out a resolution for the conflict that resulted in the Tashkent Agreement being signed under the guidance of the Soviet Union. So this is the role that Soviet Union had played in assisting India, in helping India in various ways. But the real test came in 1971 when the US turned hostile to India. If you guys remember, I had explained this as well in detail. When India was liberating Bangladesh and fighting a war with Pakistan, the United States had threatened India with war. The US became openly hostile to India in support of Pakistan. So as the US threatened Indira Gandhi's government, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi delivered a diplomatic masterstroke. India broke away from the non-aligned principle because of the American threat, and we closely embraced the Soviet Union. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi signed a historic agreement with Soviet Union, the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, through which Soviet Union guaranteed support to India in case of any American aggression. This was crucial for India to push back the US and the American pressure and to liberate Bangladesh and break Pakistan into two parts. Without the Soviet help, without the Soviet security guarantee, India wouldn't be able to proceed in this conflict. So this was a turning point. We gave up non-alignment and we became very, very close friends with the Soviet Union. All right. So I would say this marks the second phase of the relationship. Phase 2 of India-Soviet relations started from 1971 and lasted until 1991. The next 20 years marked the second phase of India-Soviet relations. So as soon as India gave up non-alignment and became an ally of a very close friend of Soviet Union became the best friend for India. It started supporting India's nuclear and space program, which India had just started out. For India, it was a strategic priority to develop nuclear weapons, especially after the 62 war with China. It was a priority for India to accelerate its space program as well. And both these programs were interlinked. And the US was targeting them. It was trying to derail our nuclear and space program. So at this point, it was Soviet Union which backed India's nuclear and space program. It gave direct support to our weapons program as well. And according to several reports, there was covert support to India, covert transfer of nuclear technology, nuclear materials to India to help India build its nuclear bomb and accelerate its space program as well. So this had a lot of geopolitical dimensions. Soviet Union became an all-weather friend. It not only backed our nuclear and space program, but more importantly, it played a critical role in the military modernization of Indian armed forces. From here onwards, India would import Soviet military equipment on a large scale, be it battle tanks, be it assault rifles, rockets, even missiles, fighter jets, submarines, etc., right? Naval ships. So you name it, any military technology, most of it would come from the Soviet Union, and it became the backbone of India's armed forces. So this is a critical role that Soviet Union played in helping in the rise of India and in the growth of India. But this relationship hit a brief end in 1991 with the end of the Cold War. As we have studied in previous classes, the Cold War came to an end in 1991 with the disintegration and collapse of the Soviet Union. The communist ideology had failed, right? We discussed this previously. Across Central and Eastern Europe, all the communist allies of Soviet Union, they started moving away from Soviet Union. They started turning towards democracies. The Soviet Union itself collapsed. There was an economic and political collapse because the communist socialist model had not worked. It had led to corruption. It had led to massive economic chaos. It had led to blunders such as the invasion of Afghanistan, right, where Soviet Union suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Afghan Mujahideen. So eventually, under the weight of all this pressure, Soviet Union collapsed and disintegrated in 1991. It broke up into several different countries. And the successor state to Soviet Union was, of course, Russia. So when Soviet Union collapsed, there were new countries formed in Eastern Europe, like Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and the others. Belarus, for example. There were Central Asian countries which were born, which we have studied in previous classes. And Russia was the biggest constituent of the Soviet Union. So Russia became the successor state to the Soviet Union. So I would call this phase 3 of our relations. Phase 3 of relations between India and Russia. Because you need to take into account our ties with Soviet Union as well. Because Russia is seen as the successor of the Soviet Union. So from 1991, India-Russia relations began. Initially, of course, there was an impact. The collapse of Soviet Union, of course, had weakened Russia. Russia was a relatively weaker power compared to the Soviet Union. It had lost a lot of territory, right? It was no longer the same economic and military power it was before. So this is what pushed India to diversify its diplomatic relations. Remember, we studied about our Look East policy. Why India looked out for new partners, new friends in 1991. Why we diversified our foreign policy to focus on Southeast and East Asia, on Africa and Latin America. Why did we establish ties with Israel, right? All these were a result of the collapse of Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. But of course, it didn't affect India-Russia relations in any negative way. Initially, it just hit a small hurdle because Russia was a relatively weaker power. It was just regaining itself. But within a year or two, India-Russia relations was back on track. The Cold War relations that were there between India and Soviet Union was practically continued by the successor state, that is Russia. The military support to our nuclear program and space program, continuing in the same manner as it was before under the Soviet Union. So in the last 30 years, from 1990s till now, you see that Russia has continued that historic relationship. It has been a reliable partner for India. It has been a trusted friend, never backstabbed or never betrayed India. It has stood for India whenever India really wanted. Because in 1990s was a very difficult period, as we have studied in previous chapters. We were facing American pressure with regard to our nuclear weapons program. When India conducted nuclear tests, we were hit with economic and technological sanctions from the Western countries. It was Russia which came to the help of India. Russia was one of the few countries which did not criticize our nuclear tests, the Pokhran-2 test in 1998. All right, there were three major powers which didn't criticize India's nuclear tests: Russia, France, and Israel. This shows how these three countries have been time-tested friends of India: Israel, France, and Russia. Because Russia understood why India needed nuclear weapons. Russia had backed our nuclear weapons program. So when we tested the nuclear weapons for the second time in 1998, Russia supported India, it did not criticize India, and it bypassed the Western sanctions. It wouldn't follow the sanctions that were imposed on India. Russia would back India during the Kargil war and during the tensions that we faced with Pakistan in 1990s. So the close strategic relationship continued, and especially in the military domain, Russia became a critical supplier to India. Just take a look at the weapons that we have imported from Russia. The Sukhoi 30 fighter jets, which today is the backbone of the Indian Air Force. It's one of the most advanced fighter jets in the world, a fourth generation fighter aircraft. It's an air dominance fighter jet. It is critical in dominating the airspace. It can be used both for defense and offensive operations. Right? The Sukhoi 30 MKI is an advanced fighter jet which is in the arsenal of the Indian Air Force, and we procured this from Russia. Even the T-90 battle tank, the T-90 battle tank of the Indian Army, is another key weapon platform that we are operating today. It's considered as one of the most advanced battle tanks in the world. And of course, the BrahMos cruise missile, which is considered as the world's fastest cruise missile and a very accurate cruise missile. So such advanced technologies, military technologies, have been shared with India. Russia even leased a nuclear-powered submarine, INS Chakra. So India could train the Navy, the Indian Navy could train its submariners in operating the Arihant class of submarines, which are the indigenously produced nuclear-powered submarines of India. Right when India was getting ready to launch the Arihant class of nuclear-powered submarines, we needed a nuclear-powered submarine to train our Navy. So Russia leased a nuclear-powered submarine. Imagine the kind of closeness that should exist for a country to transfer nuclear platforms to another country. A nuclear-powered submarine called INS Chakra was leased. It was given on lease to the Indian Navy to train the Indian Navy in operating nuclear-powered submarines. The aircraft carrier that we have, INS Vikramaditya, right? This is of Soviet origin. We procured this from Russia. Today, of course, we have an indigenous aircraft carrier program under which INS Vikrant, INS Virat are getting ready. But the sole functional aircraft carrier as of now is INS Vikramaditya. It's an old Soviet aircraft carrier which we bought and got it refurbished. And it's a critical weapon platform for the Indian Navy. Even in the civilian nuclear domain, with regard to generating electricity from nuclear energy, Russia has been a key supporter of India. It is building the Kudankulam nuclear power plant in Tamil Nadu. It will be India's biggest nuclear power plant. Around 6 major nuclear reactors are being set up here. It's Russian nuclear technology, Russian nuclear material, and Russia is executing the project with India. All right. So as you can see, post-91, Russia has basically expanded the close strategic relations that existed between India and Soviet Union. Collapse of Soviet Union didn't really change anything. There was a small break, but very quickly, Russia continued the close relations and became a strategic military partner and a key supporter of our nuclear and space program. ISRO in particular has received a lot of support from Russia, including in the development of cryogenic engines, which is crucial for lifting heavier payloads into orbit. Right? So that is the kind of close relations the two countries have developed. All right, this is the background that you should know. In 2010, we have elevated this relationship to the strategic level by signing the strategic partnership agreement. A special and privileged strategic partnership agreement was signed, which cements the special relationship between the two countries. And Russia has supported India's entry into all the export control regimes that we have studied. Russia has backed India's membership of Nuclear Suppliers Group and other export control regimes, such as MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, Australia Group, and Wassenaar Arrangement. Russia, along with many other countries, have supported India's entry into all the export control regimes. Russia has even supported UN reforms. It has at least given verbal support, just like the US. And it has said that India deserves to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council. At least verbal support has been extended. Just like France, UK, and US, which have said that India deserves to be a permanent member of UNSC. Similarly, when Russia has verbally supported reforms of the UN and India's entry into UNSC as a permanent member. So that is the kind of global support you see from Russia. And recently, we have procured the S-400 Triumph missile air defense system from Russia. Remember, we spoke about this under India-US relations, how US was opposing the S-400 deal. It initially threatened India as well with sanctions under CAATSA, under this American law, Countering America's Adversaries to Sanctions Act. Under this act, Russia has been declared as an adversary state of the US. So Russia is under primary sanctions under CAATSA, along with Iran and North Korea. So when India signed the S-400 deal, initially US said that India should stay away from this deal. If it procures S-400, then it might invite secondary sanctions on India under CAATSA. But thanks to the close ties between India and US and the importance of S-400 for India, the sanctions were not imposed on India. US has not imposed those sanctions. It has largely stayed away from it. And India has gone ahead to complete this procurement. Even after the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, right? Russia has continued the supply. It has already supplied the initial batch of S-400 missiles, and India has already started deploying them. We have even paid for these missiles by bypassing the Western sanctions against Russia. We have worked out alternate payment routes to pay for Russian weapons that we are procuring, especially the S-400 Triumph, which is critical for air defense against China and Pakistan. All right, it's crucial to secure our airspace. With regard to our space program, currently the most ambitious mission is the Gaganyaan mission of India. India's first manned space flight. ISRO has a lot of hopes. It has set out an ambitious path to place Indian astronauts in orbit again, the two to an indigenous effort. And Russia is helping in the Gaganyaan mission because Russia has pioneered human space flight and it is assisting India in critical technologies, in critical processes. For example, it's helping India in astronaut training. I don't know if you know this. The first batch of Indian astronauts have already been chosen by the Indian Air Force. The first batch of Indian astronauts who will be on board the Gaganyaan mission, they have been selected from the Indian Air Force and they've been sent to Russia 3 years back to get advanced astronaut training with help from Russia's Roscosmos. Russia is also helping India in space medicine, in space clothing. These are critical technologies for manned space flight. Space medicine, in designing and building the space capsule, which will carry the Indian astronauts, and also in helping out in space clothing, the special cloth, special equipment, special suits, space suits that astronauts have to wear, right? So in such critical areas, Russia is helping out India. It's helping us in critical areas with regard to the Gaganyaan mission. It also has a lot of hope and ambition to play a key role in our civilian nuclear program. It hopes to set up another 12 reactors in India in the coming years. And recently, we have signed a contract to indigenously produce the AK-203 assault rifles in India. I'm sure you would have heard about the AK series of assault rifles, AK-47, AK-57, AK-203. These are some of the most advanced assault rifles which are of Soviet and Russian origin, the Kalashnikov assault rifles. It's the mainstay of Indian armed forces, especially for the Indian army, and AK-203 is currently one of the advanced assault rifles available in the world. So we recently signed a contract with Russia. Russia is transferring the technology to India. Russia will not supply the weapons, it will not produce and supply the weapons to India. It's transferring the technology itself to India so that we can indigenously produce these assault rifles for our security forces. In Uttar Pradesh, near Agra, near Amethi, a manufacturing plant has been set up. An indigenous manufacturing facility has been set up at Amethi in UP, where AK-203 assault rifles are being indigenously produced with Russian technology. Right? And this will become the main assault rifle for various Indian security forces, for the Indian Army, for the border guarding forces, the Navy, Air Force, etc. All right. So this is just a overview, a broad overview of how India-Russia relations have developed over the years. I hope it gives you a complete picture. This is more than sufficient. Don't go into more details. What I've discussed, the trend, the different phases in the relationship, the analysis, and some important facts. That is more than enough. All right. Now, let me talk about something called as the Eastern Economic Forum. The Eastern Economic Forum and some of the issues that are present in India-Russia relations. These are the last two topics. And after this, I will talk about the big issue, the Russia-Ukraine war and the current divide between Russia and the Western countries and how it affects India. That is the main discussion here. As far as our exams are concerned this year, this will be the most critical topic, along with the background to India-Russia relations. So let's talk about the Eastern Economic Forum, which helps us understand the nature of economic relations between India and Russia. Let's look at some issues as well which are affecting our ties. And then finally, when I close the chapter, we'll talk about Russia-Ukraine war. See, even though India and Russia have very close strategic, military, and diplomatic relations, our economic relations have actually not flourished. Our economic ties have never met the full potential, full capacity. All right. For example, we haven't fully exploited the tourist potential. A lot of Russian tourists come to India, especially to Goa, to Manali, and other places, but we haven't fully exploited the potential of Russian tourists coming to India. Similarly, Indian tourists represent a huge market for Russia, but we haven't fully tapped this potential market. Even if you look at the bilateral trade, it's relatively low. Even if you look at investments between both the countries, Indian investments in Russia, Russian investments in India, they're comparatively low considering the close strategic military relations we have with each other. So what's the analysis here? What's the key opinion you need to take away from this? You need to understand that India-Russia relations have been dominated by the military strategic relations. That has become the top priority. Economic relations, soft power relations haven't received much priority. This is one of the flaws in the relationship. One of the weak points in the relationship is that our bilateral trade is very less. Compared to what potential exists, the bilateral trade we have is actually very less. This is also because of lack of good connectivity. The current viable route between India and Russia is via Europe. If you guys remember, we have seen this route multiple times. I've shown you various maps explaining the current route between India and Russia. If you are to send goods between India and Russia, the viable route is from here, through the Arabian Sea into Gulf of Aden and Bab el-Mandeb Strait, through the Red Sea and Suez Canal into Mediterranean, via the Atlantic across Western Europe and then Russia. This is the current trading route. It's a very long, circuitous route. It's time consuming, it's expensive. That is why we are pursuing alternate connectivity projects, such as INSDC project that we studied, which will create a shorter link between India and Russia via Iran and Azerbaijan, right? The lack of connectivity and the lack of focus on building economic ties has been an impediment in the relationship. It's one of the drawbacks in India-Russia relations. We actually don't have very strong economic ties. Very minimal economic ties exist. There's greater potential. And Eastern Economic Forum is one area which can open up that economic cooperation between India and Russia. This forum was started by President Putin. It's an initiative of Vladimir Putin to attract investments into the Russian Far East region, which is basically the Siberian Peninsula. I'm sure all of you would have heard about the Siberia region of Russia, the Siberian Peninsula. It's called the Russian Far East. It's one of the key provinces of Russia. This is where the Far East region of Russia is located. This whole province you're seeing here, right? This is the Russian Far East. See, Russia is a very large country. Its geographical extent is massive. It is blessed with great resources, especially in the Far East. There are plenty of precious resources present. All right? There is oil and gas reserves over here in the Sakhalin Peninsula. This is the Sakhalin Peninsula of the Russian Far East where oil and gas reserves are found. Believe it or not, India has investments over here. India's OVL, ONGC Videsh Limited, has a tie-up with Russian agencies like Gazprom, and they have invested in oil and gas fields at Sakhalin. Over the years, Russia has become a key oil supplier to India. It's become a key oil and gas supplier to India. This is a key point. In the Russian Far East, there are other critical resources present, including precious resources like diamonds, coal, reports of rare earth minerals, etc. Now, this is something Russia would like to exploit with its close friends like India, because Russia is struggling for investments in the Far East. So the Far East region has very adverse climatic and weather conditions. It's very close to the Arctic. This is the Arctic Circle. So you see permafrost conditions present here in the Far East. The surface is permanently frozen. The temperatures are extremely low over here. It's in the range of -30, -40 degrees Celsius, or sometimes even below than that. So it's a very inhospitable region. The population here is very, very less. It's a massive territory. It's in fact larger than India. The Far East region of Russia is much larger than India. But the population is very, very minimal here because it's inhospitable conditions. So that is why Russia is struggling here. It doesn't have enough population, enough skill, enough resources here. That's why it wants investments from the outside. That is why President Putin started this initiative in 2019 called the Eastern Economic Forum, to which Russia invites its close friends to participate in the forum and invest in the Russian Far East. And Prime Minister Modi participated in the Eastern Economic Forum meet in 2019 and announced an investment of $1 billion through a line of credit to Russia. This Indian investment in the Far East region of Russia is seen as an extension of our Act East policy. Remember, I told you, under the Act East policy, we are focusing on East Asia region. We are competing with China over here, towards Japan, towards Northern Pacific, towards the Southern Pacific. Similarly, experts believe that The Indian investment in the Russian Far East is an extension of this policy called Act Far East policy, which will give us a foothold in this part of the Pacific, in the northern Pacific, towards the Arctic and towards Russian Far East. This is a key area of competition today because there is a rush for Arctic resources. I hope you know that the melting ice caps have opened up new shipping lanes in the Arctic. It's called the Northern Shipping Route. Since the ice caps are melting due to climate change, global warming, shipping routes are opening up in the Arctic. All the Arctic countries, which are members of a grouping called Arctic Council, all right, these 8 member countries of Arctic Council, they are in a competition. All right, these are the countries present in the Arctic, such as US, Canada, then Russia, of course. You have your Nordic, Scandinavian countries such as Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, right? So these are the 8 Arctic powers that are members of this group called Arctic Council, and they're all competing for influence, competing for resources. They have started militarizing the Arctic. US, Canada, Russia, even Denmark, Norway, Finland, they've deployed military assets in the Arctic to establish their presence. There are American submarines and naval ships present in the Arctic. Russia has deployed icebreaker ships to break the ice and clear the shipping route. Recently, Russia deployed nuclear-powered icebreakers. These are ships powered by nuclear engine, and they break the ice shelves to create a shipping route. So all these countries are exerting their military influence to capitalize on the economic potential of the Arctic region. As the new shipping routes are opening up, they all want a share of the Arctic resources. So India is also in competition in the Arctic with China, Japan, and many other observers of the Arctic Council. There are many observers to the Arctic Council, which includes India and China, along with Japan, Australia, South Korea, and the others. So here we face a stiff competition from China. China is already projecting its military power in the Arctic. So India's close relations with Russia, our investments in the Russian Far East, our improving maritime links with the Russian Far East will increase Indian influence towards this northern part of the Pacific region, thus protecting our interest and influence towards the Arctic region as well. That is why our investments in the Russian Far East is very important. We have promised a line of credit of $1 billion, and we have paid a lot of attention to our consulate at Vladivostok, which is in the Russian Far East. In fact, India was one of the first countries in the world to set up a consulate here at Vladivostok. Vladivostok is a major port city. It's a major port in the Siberia region. Right? Since 92, after the Cold War ended, India became the first country to open a consulate here. So we have a diplomatic presence, and there are many Indian companies which have invested in the Russian Far East. For example, ONGC Videsh Limited has investments in the Sakhalin region. The Tata Group, Tata Power specifically, has a coal mine in the Kamchatka Peninsula of the Siberia region. There are other Indian companies having investments in the diamond and the coal sector of the Siberia region. So this is the close economic relations that we're trying to build by providing for Indian investments and Indian resources to exploit the Russian Far East region. This is one close area of collaboration. During this forum of 2019, the Eastern Economic Forum, India and Russia even agreed to create a new maritime link between Chennai and Vladivostok. The plan is to create a new, shorter maritime route connecting India and Russia to reduce dependency on the Suez Canal route. As we saw, the Suez Canal route is a much longer and a time-consuming route. It's more expensive. So we are considering a shorter route between India and Russia, a shorter maritime link that could connect the eastern port of India, that is Chennai, over here, with Vladivostok over here. This is where Vladivostok is located, in the Siberia region of Russia. So India and Russia are planning to create a new maritime link that passes through the strategic South China Sea. This route will become a key route in the Indo-Pacific region, and it brings India and Russia together. That's why Russia is also a major player in the Indo-Pacific. Right? Russia is also very interested in the Indian Ocean. It wants to have its influence here to connect with India and the Indo-Pacific. So as part of the Eastern Economic Forum initiative, India and Russia are working on creating a new maritime link between Chennai and Vladivostok, so it will project our influence in the Russian Far East. It will project Indian influence in the North Pacific, where China is already a major power, and it will also help India project itself into the Arctic region. It will help us compete with other Arctic powers and other major countries like China, which are competing for influence and resources in the Arctic. All right, so this is one very, very important point. The Eastern Economic Forum and the investments India has made in this region, plus the new shipping route that we are exploring. All these points are critical because they could take forward India-Russia relations. Of course, the weakness is the economic relationship. Right now, it has taken a bigger hit because of the Russia-Ukraine war and the Western sanctions on Russia. Now, despite all these areas of cooperation and friendship, even we have some areas of dispute and issues as well. Even India and Russia have few issues between them. For example, Russia's biggest concern is India's growing closeness with US, Israel, etc. This has caused a lot of concern for Russia. Russia has not been happy that India has gotten closer to US in the last 2 decades. Russia is not happy that we are procuring more weapons from US and Israel, which has reduced the share of weapon procurement from Russia. So this is one standing issue. See, the problem is for India, Russian weapons have given some problems. Russian technology is considered to be outdated. Russian technology is also seen as unreliable. There are a lot of issues with Russian equipment, Russian platforms. Then procuring spares and servicing the old equipment has become costly for India, as Russia has used its leverage on India to extract more price from India. Since India is heavily dependent on Russia, Russia has often pushed India to pay more for spare parts and for servicing. This is something we're not happy with. If you look at INS Vikramaditya, the aircraft carrier, the cost was almost doubled by Russia. The initial price was much lower. By the time we procured it after the refurbishment, Russia had almost doubled the price of INS Vikramaditya. We had no other option but to pay because we were dependent on Russia. Plus, Russian technology has problems, like the MiG fighter jets. It became known as a flying coffin because of frequent crashes that led to the deaths of several Indian pilots. So Russian weapons have problems. They're outdated, they're unreliable, and hence, India has diversified its weapons procurement. So this is an issue that we have with Russia. We have an issue that Russia is jacking up the prices. Its technology is a little outdated. It's a little unreliable at times, and spares and servicing is not available. So we are looking to diversify our weapon sourcing from US and Israel, and this is not liked by Russia. Plus, there is a strategic alignment. India has gotten closer to the Western countries. India has gotten very, very close to the US in the last 2 decades, and of course, Russia does not like this. So this has come up as a divide, and you see Russia getting closer to China and even to an extent Pakistan. Until recently, Russia had largely stayed away from Pakistan because of concerns for India. But now that India is getting closer to US and Western countries, procuring more weapons from them, conducting military exercises with them, Russia also has opened up closer relations with Pakistan. It has started supplying weapons to Pakistan, giving funds to Pakistan. This would never happen before. All right? It's gotten closer to China as well. Of course, Russia and China have an alignment between them. So this is a issue which is propped up. On several global issues as well, we don't have the same opinion. For example, Russia has its own viewpoint when it comes to global issues like the Syrian conflict, Iran's nuclear program. In all these, Russia is involved in a direct conflict with the West. The same with Ukraine. In all these global issues, Russia and Western countries are in direct conflict. But India has a different position. We don't align either with Russia nor with entirely with Western countries. India takes a slightly neutral stand on these issues. So it does not align entirely with Russia's position. So on certain global geopolitical issues and the closeness between India and Western countries and Russia's increasing ties with China and Pakistan, on these fronts, a divide has come up between India and Russia. Plus the recent Russian aggression against Ukraine, right? The way in which Russia invaded the country against international law, how it has created a divide with Western countries and NATO, and the sanctions on Russia. This also has created further challenges and problems for India. It makes it very difficult for India to deal with Russia, right? So these are some issues and challenges that we have present, right? But otherwise, it's a very close, very cordial relationship, a trust-based relationship. Russia has always stood for India. India has done the same. India has never let down Russia. We've always stood with Russia when it really mattered. Look at India's position during the Russia-Ukraine conflict, right? Despite Russia breaking the international rules, despite Russia being the aggressor against Ukraine, India has never criticized Russia. We have never voted against Russia at the UN in the last 1.5 years. That clearly shows how India backs Russia as well. We support Russia because Russia has given that kind of support to India in the past. So that is a special relationship that we have. But of course, there are a few issues. There are a few geopolitical strategic issues. But other than that, it's a very close, very cordial, and very friendly, trust-based relationship. All right? So this is what you need to understand about India-Russia relations. If you have this basic idea, it is more than sufficient. Now, I would like to conclude this chapter by talking about the Russia-Ukraine war. You need the background here. You also need to know the current context and the impact of the war on India and what choices India has made. That is the understanding we are looking at. You should know why this conflict started in the first place. See, if we are to explore the background to Russia-Ukraine war, the history of it goes back to the Cold War era. In fact, many experts believe that the Cold War never really came to an end. The Cold War between US and Soviet Union didn't really end, according to many experts, and they're actually right. Because after 1991, after collapse of Soviet Union, the Cold War has continued in a different form between US and Russia, the successor state to Soviet Union. US and the European countries, which constitute the West, what they did was they tried to exploit the situation in 1991. When Soviet Union collapsed, they exploited the opportunity to rapidly expand their influence towards Russia. They followed a deliberate strategy through their military grouping, the NATO, and also to the European Union, to expand Western influence towards Russian borders. The objective was very clear: to contain Russia, to keep Russia contained, as it was seen as a successor state of Soviet Union. US and the European countries both were responsible for rapidly expanding their influence in an attempt to contain Russia. See, here you're looking at the map of the Cold War period. This is the Cold War Europe, where Europe was divided between Western and Eastern blocs. This is the West, this is the East here. You can see the so-called Iron Curtain which had come up, the physical divide that divided Europe, that marked the division between Europe. European powers were divided. Some were aligned with Western countries, some with Soviet Union, some were partially neutral like Yugoslavia, which was part of non-aligned movement. But essentially, Europe was divided. A physical barrier had come up here in Central Europe that marked the divide between the European powers during Cold War. This is called the Iron Curtain of the Cold War. So the Eastern Bloc that you see here, all these countries such as Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, but then Czechoslovakia. Today, it's broken up. It's Czech Republic and Slovakia, right? All these countries that you see here, including Ukraine and your Baltic countries, your Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all these countries were part of the Soviet-led Eastern Bloc. Ukraine, Baltic states were part of Soviet Union itself. They were integral parts of Soviet Union. But the other countries you see here, like Poland, Romania, Hungary, and the others, they were all part of the Eastern Bloc. They had aligned with the Communist Socialist Bloc. So Russia, after 91, saw this region as its traditional area of influence. Now, just like India looks at Indian Ocean as our traditional area of influence, similarly, Russia saw Central Asia and Eastern Europe and even parts of Central Europe as part of its traditional area of influence. So obviously, Russia wanted to protect its interest and influence after 91. Russia wanted to protect its interest and influence post 91 as well. But this was challenged by the West, by the US and European countries through their groupings. That is NATO, which is a military alliance, right? North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a military alliance of the Cold War period. And the European Union, which is a regional grouping of European countries. Through these organizations, Western countries rapidly pushed their influence, expanded their influence. They expanded the membership of NATO and European Union, which you can clearly see in this map over here. There has been a rapid expansion of NATO and EU membership into Central and Eastern Europe. All the former Eastern Bloc countries, including former Soviet republics, they were all made members of NATO and European Union. Look at the list of countries here, which have joined NATO after 97. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. These are all part of Soviet Union. Look at the other Eastern Bloc countries, Poland, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and towards the Balkan region. This is the Balkan region here. All these countries, which traditionally were under Soviet influence, later under Russian influence, they were brought under NATO and European Union one by one. Now, recently, you might have read about a development. Finland has become the latest member of NATO. Correct? Finland was not a member of NATO until recently, but just a few days back, it has formally joined NATO. So like this, Western countries have expanded their influence, brought new members under their groups, and directly threatened Russian influence and Russian interests. The problem for Russia is that NATO countries, they promise collective defense for each other. It's a military grouping that promises collective defense. Under NATO, there's a principle. the principle of collective defense, under which the members treat an attack on one country as an attack against every other member. Let's say if Poland were to be attacked, they will treat it as an attack on all NATO countries, and all NATO countries together will fight against the aggressor. So in the light of this principle of collective defense, they start stationing military troops and military equipment in other countries. So as these countries joined NATO, what happened was back. It is formally joined NATO. So like this, Western countries have and Russian interests. NATO countries and all NATO countries together will fight against other countries. Air defense missile systems, which would effectively contain Russia's nuclear deterrent. Right? It could bring down Russia's nuclear options if Russia ever wanted to go to a nuclear war. This was a clear attempt in the last 30 years to contain and keep Russia limited to this region. So this angered Russia. So since then, a Cold War was raging between them. But the biggest conflict was over Ukraine. Ukraine has always been a prized asset for Russia. Economically, strategically, Ukraine has been critical for Russia. And Ukraine slowly was coming under Western influence. In 2014, there was a major revolution that took place in Ukraine called the Euromaidan protests. All right? If you guys remember, under Central Asia, I actually spoken about this briefly. Between the year 2000 and 2014, Russia was actually trying to bring Ukraine into an economic group called the Eurasian Economic Union. Remember, we spoke about this economic union under Central Asia. Russia was very keen to bring Ukraine as a member to establish a strong economic union. But in Ukraine, there was a movement towards joining European Union, or there was a deal that was being worked out, a trade agreement was being worked out with European Union. Now, Russia did not like this. Russia was backing the pro-Russian government in Ukraine, but when Ukraine broke this agreement with European Union, and when it came closer to signing this treaty with Russia to enter the Eurasian Economic Union, massive protests broke out led by the people of UK and by opposition parties in UK. At that point, the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian president, was pro-Russia. So Russia had used its influence to keep Ukraine away from European Union. At the last minute, the deal with EU was cancelled, and Ukraine was getting ready to enter Eurasian Economic Union, which was led by Russia. When this decision was taken by Ukraine, it led to protests by the opposition parties and by the people, and they resisted the Russian influence. It triggered massive protests called Euromaidan protests, and Russia believes that these protests were sponsored by Western intelligence agencies. Russia had reasons to believe that Western intelligence, led by the CIA and European intelligence agencies, were sponsoring these protests. This led to a pro-Western government getting installed in UK. Pro-Western leaders took power in Ukraine. Ukraine became a pro-West country, and this led Russia to retaliate. Russia retaliated immediately in 2014. It took two major steps, two drastic steps were taken by Russia to protect its influence, which was to annex the Crimean Peninsula, which you see here. The strategic Crimean Peninsula that includes the Sevastopol port was occupied by Russia in a military operation, and it sponsored a separatist war in eastern Ukraine over here, in Donetsk and Luhansk, which are part of the Donbas region. In the eastern Ukrainian region, the Donbas region, in Luhansk and Donetsk, in these two provinces, Russia backed a rebellion. There are pro-Russian speakers in this part of Ukraine who are associated with Russia. So Russian intelligence agencies, Russian armed forces, gave direct funds, weapons, and support to the separatist groups, and they triggered a massive insurgency in eastern Ukraine. Russian armed forces invaded Crimea, captured the strategic Crimean Peninsula, thus establishing Russia's firm control over the Black Sea. So since then, hostilities were brewing between Russia and Ukraine. So the war you saw last year, it's not something new, it didn't happen overnight. It's been building up over the last 30 years. It's actually a direct outcome of the Cold War. It's an outcome of Western pressure, Western expansion of their influence, and how Russia tries to counter them. Both sides are to be blamed here. So Russia has tried to protect its influence by resorting to aggression, by using violence, by going to any extent possible to protect its interests. Right? So this has led to a buildup of tensions between Russia and Western countries. When Russia occupied Crimea and sponsored a separatist war, immediately Russia was thrown out of the G8 grouping. G8 became G7 because the Western countries, they threw out Russia, they boycotted Russia. Russia was placed under sanctions by the Western countries, mainly by the US. All right? So tensions were already building up between them from 2014 itself. And now, in 2021, it was widely reported that Ukraine is considering a possible NATO and European Union membership. This was the final nail in the coffin. There were widespread reports that Western countries have offered membership to Ukraine in NATO and EU, and it was believed that Ukraine might apply for membership. Now, this was seen as a major threat by Russia because if Ukraine were to join NATO, if it were to become a military ally of the Western countries and join economic groupings like European Union, that would essentially end Russian influence. Western troops, American weapons would be stationed in Ukraine right next door to Russia. This is something Russia couldn't tolerate. That is why in 2021, Russia started a massive military buildup. It started a massive military buildup, and it started mobilizing troops on all the sides from the north, east, and south. More than 1 lakh Russian troops were mobilized. And eventually, in 2022, in February 2022, Russian President Putin declared war. He announced that a special military operation has been launched to protect Russian interests in Ukraine. He declared Ukraine as a terrorist state. And Russia invaded the country, which was clearly an illegal invasion. It's against international law to break the sovereignty of another country without a valid reason. Yes, tensions were there between Russia and Western countries. Yes, Russian interests were being undermined by Western countries, no doubt. It was Western countries which triggered Russia. But resorting to full war, full-fledged war against Ukraine, targeting innocent people and civilians, is completely against international law. So from February 2022, Russia went to war against Ukraine. It made very rapid advances from the north, east, and the south. It appeared as if Russia is going to capture the whole of Ukraine and topple the Ukrainian government. But very quickly, Ukraine managed to hold itself. It resisted the Russian attack. And today, Ukraine has pushed back the Russian assault. Of course, Western countries have played a critical role here. They have given massive funds to Ukraine and weapons. US and European countries have supplied advanced weaponry, including air defense missiles, drones, advanced intelligence. They promised battle tanks. They provided training. Covert intelligence support has been given, along with billions of dollars in support. And this assistance has helped Ukraine to resist the Russian attack. Ukraine repealed the northern attack from Belarus. Ukraine defended the capital Kiev and pushed back the Russian invaders. A huge battle was fought here at Kharkiv, a critical location where thousands of Indian students were stuck. Ukraine has managed to push back the Russian attack here as well. But Russia has captured these territories. Along with Crimea, which was already captured in 2014, this whole stretch you are seeing here, that includes Mariupol, this whole region, including the Donbas region, they've all been captured by Russia. They are under Russian control today. Russia has even declared these territories as independent and as part of Russian territory. Donetsk and Luhansk, they were declared as independent countries. And Russia even held a so-called referendum, a so-called election, in which the people apparently voted for Russia. And Russia has said that Donetsk and Luhansk have merged with Russian Union. So essentially, Russia has expanded its territory. It's looking to form a corridor connecting the separatist hit area, which have been liberated, that is the Donetsk and Luhansk region, with the Crimean Peninsula. This whole region has been captured by Russia as of now, but Ukraine also has pushed back. And the war has right now hit a stalemate. It's hit a dead end. Neither Russia is winning, nor Ukraine is completely pushing Russia back. This is where the conflict stands as of today. You need not go into further details. You just need to know the broad trajectory of the war, right? But where does this leave India? How does this affect India? That is the biggest question. See, this war had a global economic impact. The global economy was just recovering from the pandemic. And right at that point, Russia invaded Ukraine and disrupted the global supply chains. Russia and Ukraine are critical suppliers of essential commodities. Both are major agricultural countries. They are some of the top suppliers of essential food items like wheat, then soybeans, corn, sunflower seeds, and sunflower oil, etc. They also produce a lot of engineering equipment, which is critical for the global supply chains. So the global supply chains and global economy was disrupted because of this war, because of the conflict that broke out. It had a widespread economic impact, and Western countries retaliated with crippling sanctions against Russia. They cut off Russian banks from the SWIFT banking system. They have placed sanctions on Russian officials, Russian companies. They have made it very difficult to trade and deal with Russia. Making transfers, making payments to Russian entities, Russian companies has become nearly impossible because of the crippling Western sanctions. They have mainly targeted key sectors like oil, defense, etc. This places India in a very challenging position because we cannot compromise our ties with Russia at any cost. The military supplies from Russia are critical for India. The oil, gas supplies are also crucial for our energy security. More importantly, Russia is a time-tested friend. Russia has always stood for India. Now it was India's time to pay back. That's exactly what India has done. India has taken a neutral stand on the conflict itself. We haven't directly taken any position here. We have never criticized Russia openly and publicly. We have just called on both the parties to reach a negotiated settlement. India just reminded Putin once that this is not a time for war. Prime Minister Modi, when he interacted with Putin during the G20 summit, India just reminded Putin that this is not a time for war. We called upon Russia to end the war, but we haven't criticized the invasion itself. We haven't criticized the human rights violations, the war crimes that have been reported in Ukraine. Multiple resolutions have been moved against Russia at the United Nations and various international organizations. India has abstained from all these votes. We have abstained from all these votes. We have never voted against Russia. All right? And more importantly, we have bypassed the Western sanctions. We have found alternate payment routes, and we have become one of the biggest buyers of Russian oil and gas because Russia was desperate to sustain its revenue. It was desperate to sell its oil and gas to fund the war, right? Russian economy was taking a hit because of the sanctions. So it started selling oil and gas at a cheaper price, at a discounted price. This opportunity was lapped up by India and China, the two biggest buyers of Russian oil and gas. They increased their buying of Russian oil and gas. That's why I told you in the previous class that Russia has become the second top supplier of oil and gas to India in the last year. Usually it is Saudi Arabia, which is the second biggest supplier. But Russia has overtaken Saudi Arabia for India as far as oil and gas supplies are concerned because we have bought large quantities of Russian oil and gas as Russia was giving it at a discounted price. This brings down our import bill. It reduces our import cost. It ensures our energy security and maintains our strategic ties with Russia. So India has taken a conscious decision to stay neutral in the conflict. We have never criticized Russia till date. We have only called for the end of the war through negotiations. We have urged both parties to talk, to settle the dispute and end the war immediately. We have expressed concern about human rights situation, but we have not blamed it on Russia. All right? We haven't supported the Western countries and their resolutions at UN and various international organs. At various international organizations, Russia has been targeted, but India has not supported any of these resolutions. We have just abstained from all the votes, thereby showing our neutral position and our indirect backing to Russia. All right? So this is where things stand as of today, and this is what you need to understand from an examination point of view. So in current affairs, please keep a track of the progress of the conflict. What will happen in the coming days? How will it affect India? What's India's position on the war? Right? These are the key points you need to monitor from current affairs. But this analysis is more than sufficient to answer a mains question. All right? So on this note, I would like to bring my discussion on India-Russia to an end. If you have any doubts, please bring it up. I'll take up all your doubts and questions. And in the meantime, let's take a short break as well. We've completed one entire chapter. We're left with two small topics, European Union and United Nations. I want to discuss two important organizations, that is EU and the UN, before we close the syllabus. So take a short 10 minutes break, come back by 7:30. I'll take all your doubts and then we'll get started with India and European Union. All right? Hello everyone, welcome back to the session. Now first let me take up all your doubts and questions on India-Russia relations, and then we'll start out with European Union and then the United Nations. First question is by Vikas. Vikas is asking, so Finland considered as a neutral country and mostly mediates between two rivals, then why Finland has joined NATO? See, this is a direct result of Russian aggression. Finland and even Norway, they both share borders with Russia. Yes, you're absolutely right. Previously, Finland and Norway were neutral. Why? Because they were worried about inviting any Russian aggression if they chose sides with Western countries. So during the Cold War, these countries, these Scandinavian countries, that is Finland and Norway, they have largely remained neutral. They never joined NATO. But now that Russia has become so aggressive, right, it has invaded Ukraine, it has threatened other neighbors. These countries also have felt threatened, Finland and Norway. That is why when Russia declared the war, both Finland and Norway applied for NATO's membership. Sweden is also looking for NATO's membership, right? So Finland has been admitted, right? That's the reason why Finland has joined NATO. It's mainly because of the fear of Russian aggression. Any other questions? Sir, PPT, please. PPT would have been shared with you. Please check with the SMEs. The PPT would have been shared with you. SS is asking what is NATO. As I told you, NATO is a military alliance of Western countries, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was formed immediately after the Second World War, when the Cold War started. Right? In 1949, the NATO was established as a military grouping of the Western countries. Please let me know if you have any other doubts. Satyam is asking, sir, Turkey is a NATO member but still has S-400. Why? Yes, Turkey is a NATO member, but Turkey has close relations with Russia as well. For its defense, it procured S-400 missiles from Russia, just like India, and that is why Turkey was hit with sanctions by the US. The Katsa sanctions I was talking about, secondary sanctions, they were applied on Turkey by the US because a NATO member was procuring advanced weapons from Russia. That too when Russia is under sanctions. So that is why Turkey was hit by sanctions under Katsa. Military clubs, there's no way that India would ever join, and there's no offer as well for India to join NATO. NATO is meant for Western countries. It's a Eurocentric military grouping. There's no reason why India would be invited. Sakib is asking why Russia is blocking Sweden's entry. Obviously, because Russia does not want more of its neighbors to join NATO grouping. If more and more Russian neighbors join NATO, then Russia's military influence will increase. That's why Russia is opposing the membership of Finland, Sweden, and other countries. Manoj is asking, are Australia, New Zealand, Canada not important to study? Australia is important. We've already covered it. India, Australia was covered in detail. New Zealand is not too important. Canada, only the part relevant for Khalistan extremism has been covered. That is more than enough. Bharadwaj is asking, what's the current situation of Ukraine war? The war continues. It's a stalemate. Russia is making some new aggressions. It is trying to escalate the war, but Ukraine is fighting back. So the war continues. It's a stalemate situation. Neither side are winning the conflict because Ukraine is able to fight back due to the Western support. So it's a stalemate as of now. Nilesh is asking, as China, Russia have signed a treaty, won't it affect India-Russia relations? Not exactly, because see, Russia has its own independent ties with India. Yes, Russia, China are very close to each other as far as counting the Western countries are concerned, but Russia has a special relationship with India that will always be protected. Sir, in main, should we write answers in points or in paragraph format? See, this depends on the question, on the type of question which has been asked. If it's a very factual question asking for basic facts, then point-wise format would be better. If it's asking for thorough analysis, it's asking for your opinion, then paragraph format would be better. Or you can use a mix of both. This depends on the writing style of each student. You can't, go predetermine that I'll write all answers in bullet point format. I'll write all answers in paragraph format. It doesn't work like that. Depends on your writing style. So you have to figure out what suits you better. Depending on the question, you have to choose the point-wise format or paragraph or a mix of both. Okay, so these are the questions. Now let's come back to our discussion. We'll look at two important organizations as we end the syllabus for IR. I want to talk about EU, the European Union. The EU is very important for prelims and also for mains. There are specific topics that are important. For prelims, the structure of EU and the background can be important. The structure of the organization, the different organs of European Union, its history, the treaties governing European Union can be relevant for your prelims. So I'll cover that briefly. Next, for mains, India's relations with European Union, especially the ongoing free trade negotiations. This topic will be very, very relevant for our mains examination. All right, so let's take a look at these important points. The European Union is essentially a political and economic union. It's just like any other regional organization that we have studied. It's similar to ASEAN, SAARC, BIMSTEC, Gulf Cooperation Council. Just like you have such groupings for certain regions. Similarly, the EU represents the Europe region. It's a political and economic union of 27 European member states. There are 27 countries which are part of it today. It was 28, but United Kingdom voted for Brexit in 2016 as it wanted to quit European Union. As majority of the people in UK supported Brexit, they supported the referendum in 2016, the UK has quit European Union. Why? Because UK had a lot of differences with European Union. Because when you become part of such a close economic and political grouping, you have to compromise on your sovereignty, on your independence. The EU is such an integrated group. It has brought the countries so close that they have common economic policies, common monetary policies. They have several common laws and regulations. They even have a common foreign policy and security policy. So for the entire region, if you're coming up with common policies such as these, then obviously the member countries have to compromise a bit on their independence, on their sovereignty. For example, in the EU region, you have something called the Schengen zone. Some of you would have heard about it. If you've ever traveled to European countries, you might have got the Schengen visa. Schengen zone is a passport-free zone. Passport controls, border controls have been eliminated. There are no border controls in the Schengen zone. For example, if goods have to be sent from France to Germany, there are no border checks, no duties imposed on it. Free movement of goods, free movement of investments, and more importantly, free movement of people has been provided within the Schengen zone of countries. So if you apply for a Schengen visa, you get a Schengen visa. Non-EU citizens, like Indians, for example, you can travel to all the Schengen countries with just one visa. On the other hand, citizens of the Schengen countries can go from one country to another without the need for passport controls, no border checks, no security checks, no visa requirement. They have truly established open borders between them, similar to India and Nepal. Now that is something very unique. They are taking a risk in compromising on their economic and security policies by creating open borders, right? So this requires a certain compromise on your sovereignty, on your independence, because you need to accept the common laws, the common policies of the entire group. This is where the UK had a problem. UK had a problem that it was contributing more to European Union. It wasn't getting much in return. So in UK, it became a political issue. The whole society, politics of UK was divided between pro-European Union and anti-European Union. This led to a referendum in 2016. A direct election was held where majority of the people, 52% of the people of UK, voted for Brexit. Brexit means Britain's exit from European Union. So following the referendum, Britain began the process of quitting the EU, and now it has completed the exit process. So UK is no longer a member of EU. It was a member before. So there are 27 member countries in this grouping. Some of them are part of the Schengen zone where open borders exist, border controls have been abolished, and some of them are part of a monetary union as well called Eurozone, where they have adopted a common currency, which is the euro. Now imagine this, just try to get things in perspective. This was a region which was fighting against each other. There were countries fighting against each other just 100 years back. In the 19th and 20th century, there was complete war, conflict that ravaged the European continent. There was a lot of enmity between different countries, between France and Germany, between UK and Germany, and various other European powers. Today, it's one of the most united, integrated regions in the world. They have abolished border controls, created open borders, established common currencies, and created a common economic union, providing for free movement of goods, investments, and people. How is this possible? This is a tremendous achievement, right? From a conflicted continent, from one of the most destabilized continent, it has become one of the most stable, developed continent in the world. All the members you find here, the 27 countries, they're all in the very high development index category. Especially West European and Central European countries, they have a very high development index, human development index. On the HDI scale, with regard to human development, they've solved the basic problems. They've solved the basic problems of literacy, healthcare, food, jobs, etc. These socio-economic problems have been addressed. They have developed industrialized economies with very high human development index. Now, this transition was possible because of the European Union. The EU has played a critical role in transforming the European continent. From a hostile, conflicted region, it has become one of the most integrated regions today by adopting common policies through this grouping called EU. All right? There is free movement of people, goods, services, and even capital. There is an internal single market created, and common laws and policies are being adopted with no border controls in the Schengen area. The whole credit for this goes to the organization called European Union. That is why it was awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012. Because through this regional and economic integration, it brought peace and stability to the European continent and to the rest of the world. It has provided for regional and economic integration. By integrating Europe, it provided not only for the welfare and development of the region, it also ended the hostilities. It brought stability to the region. That is why it was awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize. These countries today, some of them, around 19 countries out of 27, have adopted a common currency, that is euro. They're part of the Eurozone, and they represent one of the most developed regions in the world. They account for a significant part of the global GDP. Look at this statistic. This statistic I've added deliberately here. It's very, very important. They account for just 7.3% of the global population, but they're contributing almost 22.2% of the global GDP. That shows how developed and industrialized the region has become, and the credit goes to this organization called European Union. All right? This is the importance of the EU. India has very, very important relations with EU. I'm going to explain this a little later. I'll explain the economic relations, the diplomatic relations we have with the European Union. All right? But before that, let's examine its history and the structure of European Union. It's a very factual discussion here, but these facts are very relevant for your prelims. It's possible for UPSC to ask a factual question on the structure and the background of European Union. So you should have that basic awareness. See, after the World War ended, when the Second World War came to an end, as you know, European continent was ravaged. It was destroyed by the conflict. Economies had collapsed. Infrastructure had been destroyed. Welfare had been compromised. So as soon as the World War came to an end, the primary focus of West European countries was to promote welfare. The primary focus was to promote socio-economic development, to rebuild the lives of the people, to rebuild the infrastructure, rebuild the economy, take care of the refugees who had been created, provide basic facilities to people like education, food, healthcare, etc. This became a priority for at least the West European countries after the Second World War. So some of these like-minded West European democracies, they came together to form the initial group of the region called European Coal and Steel Community in 1952. This is seen as the predecessor to the regional grouping. European Union was created much later. All right, I'll explain when EU was established. But before the EU, there were a few predecessor organizations, and the first grouping to be set up here was the European Coal and Steel Community that was set up in 1952. Some of the West European countries, they are blessed with coal and steel resources, coal, iron ore, steel factories. This is what powered the industrial revolution of Europe, right? So from France to Germany, across this region, in Western Europe, there are countries blessed with coal and iron ore, and steel industry is what really powered the industrial revolution. So to exploit these resources together and to cooperate and help out each other, they formed this grouping called the Coal and Steel Community. This was the first step in creating regional economic integration in Europe. All right, this led to a success. It became a successful initiative. The West European countries, which were part of it, they all benefited from this cooperation. They could help out each other. They could share and pool the resources together and work towards the benefit and development of each other. So based on this model and this success, they signed the Treaty of Rome in 1957. The Treaty of Rome is very, very important because this established the European Economic Community, which is the predecessor of European Union. It laid the stepping stone, the foundation for a regional grouping in Europe, and all the West European democracies came together. Remember, the members were very few because it was the Cold War period. As we saw, Europe was divided during this period between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Germany, for example, was divided between West and East Germany, right? So there was a clear ideological divide. So only the Western democracies, the West European democracies, such as Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and West Germany, these like-minded Western democracies, they signed the Treaty of Rome to set up the European Economic Community. This was one of the first major economic groupings of the world, and they created a common customs union to eliminate tariffs, to reduce tariff-based barriers, and to promote the free movement of goods and commodities. This brought development. It brought benefits to all the countries. They even started collaborating in the field of science and technology. In advanced fields of science and technology, research and development, they started collaborating together, and they set up Euratom to focus on nuclear research. This was a direct outcome of the Treaty of Rome. The Treaty of Rome established the economic community, provided for economic cooperation, and it also established collaboration in the science and tech and research and development domain. This became the defining aspect of Treaty of Rome. All right. Even today, if you look at European Union, you will see that it's not only focused on economic cooperation, it's also focused on science and technology cooperation in critical areas like artificial intelligence, in the field of nuclear research, space cooperation, defense and military cooperation. There is very close collaboration between these European powers. So the foundation for this was laid in 1957 when the Treaty of Rome was signed. Is that clear? To this, the West European democracies, they started working together. They collaborated. Later, the United Kingdom also joined the grouping. So all these like-minded countries worked together, they helped each other out, and they started growing together. In 1985, they signed the Schengen Agreement, abolishing border controls and creating open borders, thus establishing the Schengen zone. Border controls were eliminated among the member countries, those who signed the Schengen Agreement. Right? It basically gave for free movement for people as well. People could move from one country to another, settle in another country. A French citizen can go to Germany and settle down, take a job there, buy property, settle down forever. They don't have to go through any checks, no border controls, no visa requirements. Right? They would essentially get equal treatment across the Schengen area. So this facilitated businesses. Business thrived across Europe because of the free movement of goods, services, investments, and people. So establishment of Schengen zone was critical. That brought the countries together as it abolished the border controls. Then came a massive change in 1990, 1991. The very face of Europe underwent a change. The map of Europe changed with the collapse of Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union. You will study this in world history. In 1989, Germany reunified. The Berlin Wall, which divided Berlin and West Germany and East Germany, was brought down. Communism saw a defeat in Central Europe and Germany reunified. This spread very quickly. Other communist states also started abandoning communism, like Poland, Hungary, Romania. They all gave up communism. And eventually, the Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991. So the Cold War came to an end. The Iron Curtain was removed. The Iron Curtain, which divided Europe, was removed in 1991. This was an opportunity for the European countries, and very quickly, it started expanding the group. That's why Treaty of Rome was outdated right now. Since the very map of Europe had changed, right? The very geopolitics of Europe had changed, Treaty of Rome was no longer relevant. So West European countries grabbed the opportunity. They signed a new treaty called Maastricht Treaty to replace the Treaty of Rome. This is how the European Union was established. All right? If UPSC asks you a prelims question, which treaty established the European Union? The answer is Maastricht Treaty, signed in 1992 to replace the Treaty of Rome. Which treaty established the European Economic Community and Euratom? The answer is Treaty of Rome, signed in 1957. That was the initial grouping of European countries. But now that the geopolitics of Europe changed after Cold War, Maastricht Treaty was signed as a replacement of Treaty of Rome, and it established the European Union. Basically, the European Economic Community became the European Union and expanded its membership. Very quickly, new countries were added from Central and Eastern Europe, which were free from the communist influence. They all started joining European Union one by one. They even set up a common monetary union, adopting a common currency, that is the euro, which today is a global reserve currency. Like the US dollar, the euro is also a global reserve currency today. So 19 member countries have accepted euro as their national currency, which means they've given up their monetary sovereignty. Usually a country has full sovereign control over its currency. Now take India, for example. The RBI, the Central Bank of India, and of course the Government of India, they exercise full control over our monetary policy, over the Indian rupee. But European countries have given up the power, they've shared it with other countries by forming a monetary union, by adopting a common currency. It has a lot of benefits despite the risks. If they really work together, collaborate with each other, common currencies can boost trade. It can boost economic opportunities. That is why any regional grouping, any economic union, right, their ambition is always to have a common currency. Even SAARC had an ambition at one point to have a common currency, because common currency will reduce the transaction costs. It will facilitate trade. It will facilitate the easier movement of goods. It improves your exports and imports. That is what EU achieved by forming a common monetary union. Today, it's the second largest reserve currency, the euro. All right. And in 2004, it saw a major expansion when many East European countries and Balkan countries joined the grouping. All these were previously under Soviet influence. All these East European countries, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, right, the Balkan countries, so the Balkan region in the southeast part of Europe, they all joined the grouping, and very quickly its membership expanded. You see a dramatic shift happening here. Post 1991, you see a sudden and a significant expansion of EU membership. This whole region here, almost the entire region came under EU. The Baltic countries, the Balkan countries, Central European countries, right? They all became members of EU, thus firmly establishing EU as one of the most powerful groupings of the world. All right. So this group was established through the Maastricht Treaty, which lasted from 1992 to 2007. In 2007, another treaty was signed, the Lisbon Treaty, which today governs the European Union. Today, this is the constitution of the EU. It has replaced the Maastricht Treaty because since new countries joined the group's membership expanded. Its role, its performance, its objectives were changing. A new treaty was necessary, and Lisbon Treaty was signed, which today is the constitution of the European Union. It has replaced the Maastricht Treaty. So Treaty of Rome and Maastricht Treaty are no longer in operation. They've all been replaced by Lisbon Treaty. Lisbon Treaty is what currently governs the EU and its functioning. It has created new institutions. It led to the adoption of a common foreign policy and security policy for the whole European region. They actually coordinate their foreign and security policy. There's a president of the European Council who acts as the president of the entire region and the entire grouping itself. So such new institutions were created and common foreign and security policies were adopted through the Lisbon Treaty. It defines the relations between the members. It defines how economic relations will happen between these countries. It defines how a country can quit. For example, when Brexit happened, when Britain quit EU, it quit under the provisions of Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. Article 50 of Lisbon Treaty defines the exit process, how a country can quit the grouping. So all these procedures, these processes, provisions are defined under the Lisbon Treaty. That's why I told you, this is the constitution of the European Union. It governs the EU today. All right? Just like BIMSTEC Charter was signed, which governs the BIMSTEC. Similarly, Lisbon Treaty was signed to form the constitution of the European Union. So today, There are primary organs of the EU which have been set up through the Lisbon Treaty, and you should be familiar with them. You should know the primary organs. This is the most important point. UPSC might ask a question here. Based on the primary institutions of EU, there can be a prelims question. So please note down the point here. There are 7 primary organs. You have the European Council, Council of European Union, European Parliament, European Commission, Court of Justice, European Central Bank, and the European Court of Auditors. These are the 7 principal organs of the European Union. They all have a distinct function. Their composition is different, their functions are also different. European Council is the supreme body. It's the most powerful organ of the EU, and the composition includes the presidents and prime ministers of the member countries. That's why it's the most powerful organ. It's essentially a policy guidance body. It guides the policies of European Union, lays the objectives, the vision, and it's the supreme decision-making body. All right? That is the role of the European Council. It's the supreme body of the EU, the most powerful organ, because all the head of states and head of governments are members of this council. It's headed by the president of the European Union, the president of the European Council. So these leaders, they come together to lay the agenda for the group. They identify the long-term vision, the objectives. They make the big decisions, and they provide policy guidance, how the policy should proceed. They advise, they provide guidance, and make the big decisions. So it's a supreme policy-making body. Then you have the legislative organs. There are 2 legislative organs. Just like we have a Lok Sabha and a Rajya Sabha, which constitutes our legislature, our parliament. Similarly, there are 2 legislative organs of the EU, the Council of European Union and the European Parliament. Council of European Union is more like our Rajya Sabha, where members are largely nominated or indirectly elected. They're not directly elected by the people, right? Something similar happens here. The representatives of each country, the diplomats representing each country, they are nominated to the Council of European Union. That's why I compared it with Rajya Sabha. They're not directly elected by the people. They act as representatives of the country. All right, they're nominated here. The respective diplomats, they are part of the Council of European Union. Whereas European Parliament, the MPs are directly elected by the people. The European citizens who are part of the group, they vote for their respective MPs. There are MPs elected here to the European Parliament. So collectively, together, they function as the legislative organ, which means they can enact laws and they have budgetary control over the budget of the European Union. They frame laws, they come out with policies, they discuss, debate them, and enact them into laws, which becomes a common law for the whole European region, for all the members of European Union, right? They have budgetary control. So these are the legislative organs, making laws for the European Union. Then you have European Commission, which is like the executive organ. It implements the laws and the decisions of the other 3 bodies. It's like the government, the executive branch of the EU. It implements the policies, the advisory and the guidelines of the European Council. It implements the laws and policies enacted and brought out by the Council and the European Parliament. All right? So European Commission is the executive branch. So when India negotiates with European Union, the negotiations will happen with European Commission, because European Commission is like the government, the executive. So when we are negotiating a free trade agreement, the negotiations between the government of India is taking place with European Commission. Once the treaty is finalized, it will have to be approved by the legislative bodies, by the European Parliament and the Council of European Union. All right, so that's how it works. So there is a policy making and advisory body at the top. There are 2 legislative organs and 1 executive organ. The rest are very simple. There is a court to resolve disputes between members, companies, and individuals. Any disputes between European members, between European companies, or between European institutions, they will be settled by the Court of Justice. There is a central bank to administer the monetary policy of Eurozone, just like RBI administers the monetary policy of India and regulates the Indian rupee. Similarly, the ECB regulates the euro currency and comes out with a common monetary policy. And there's a court of auditors to audit, just like we have a CAG, the Comptroller and Auditor General of India. There's a European Court of Auditors to audit the funds, the budget, the expenditure. These are the 7 primary organs of European Union. All right, please remember the names and the brief functions and composition that I have highlighted. It's very factual. There can be a basic factual question in your prelims. All right. Now I come to the last part of my discussion where we talk about India's relations with the EU. We'll discuss the focus areas of cooperation like defense, security, trade, the free trade negotiations, then collaboration in the field of science and technology and research and development. These are some important areas of collaboration between India and the EU. We have very, very important trade and investment relations. The EU is one of India's biggest trading partners. It's a huge export market for India. The EU also takes a lot of investments from India. It brings a lot of investments into India. So there's investments happening on both the sides. A lot of Indian companies have invested in the EU. There's a lot of funds coming from European Union towards India as FDI and even into a capital market. So investments are crucial between the 2 sides. Plus, the EU is a major export destination for India. It's critical for our agriculture, for our MSME industry, even for the large industries. All right. So it's a huge market for India and one of the largest trading partners for India. Another focus area is education. As you know, thousands of Indian students, they go to European countries to study every year. There's a lot of collaboration as well between Indian universities and European universities. There's a proposal to bring foreign universities to India. Plus, Indian students, they face a lot of challenges with regard to their visa, with regard to their employment, with regard to their social security. They face a lot of problems in foreign countries. So helping them out is a priority for India. That's why education is a top focus. This is bringing a lot of revenue to those countries. Indian students who are studying in European universities, they're bringing a lot of revenue to those countries. They also form a cultural link, a soft power link between India and European Union. So education is another focus area. Climate change and sustainable development goals. European countries are quite responsible when it comes to dealing with climate change, tackling global warming, dealing with poverty, healthcare issues, education-related issues, etc. European countries have a strong commitment to achieve the SDG goals of the UN and help other countries like India. They're very focused on achieving the Paris Agreement targets. So there's a lot of collaboration here between India and EU in the field of green energy, in adopting cleaner technologies, transitioning towards a decarbonized economy. There's a lot of collaboration in socio-economic welfare. These countries, they help, they give funds, they give technical assistance to countries like India to solve their socio-economic problems so they can achieve their sustainable development goals. Another important area is security cooperation, counterterrorism, intelligence sharing, defense cooperation through military exercises, and even through sale of weapons. India has procured a lot of weapons from European countries. This has become a top priority. Countering terrorism in the Afghanistan-Pakistan belt is a common concern. It affects both the sides, right? Terrorism in the Afghanistan-Pakistan belt has hit European countries multiple times, and it of course affects India. So tackling terrorism in the region and at the global level is a common objective. So we have very close intelligence sharing with European intelligence agencies. We work closely with the French, the German, the Italian, and also the UK intelligence agencies. We share information with each other. We are focused on counterterrorism. We have a lot of military exercises that take place, and we even procure weapons. There are a lot of key weapon platforms we procure from European countries. Plus, there are close cultural exchanges, focus on research and development, science and technology, and law enforcement. These are the priority areas in India-EU relations. All right. Now, let's look at some of the initiatives. Let's look at some specific initiatives, any achievements that can be quoted as examples to highlight India-EU relations. Let's look at the science and technology domain and research and development domain. This is a critical area of collaboration because you have many Indian institutions working closely with European scientific institutions. Take, for example, ISRO. Space cooperation is crucial between India and European countries. ISRO works very closely with the European Space Agency. We work individually as well with each country, with the major powers like France, UK, Germany, and others. There's very close collaboration here. For example, if you look at the NAVIC satellite system of India, the IRNSS, which is a regional satellite navigation system, there is a technology assistance that we got from European countries through the Galileo satellite system. Just like US has the GPS, the global positioning system. Similarly, European countries, Russia, China, they have their own versions of global positioning systems. Russia has GLONASS. GLONASS is the Russian version of GPS. Similarly, European countries have the Galileo satellite system, providing for positional and navigational information. This serves both a civilian application in navigation, in guidance, in geolocation, geotagging, etc. It also serves a military application in guiding missiles, in guiding fighter jets, etc. So in setting up India's regional navigation satellite system, the NAVIC or the IRNSS, there was a technology assistance from European countries where we got support from the Galileo satellite system. All right, so that is one example. Another example is ISRO launching European satellites, research satellites. I'm sure you know that ISRO launches foreign satellites. It earns foreign exchange for India. ISRO's PSLV has become a very reliable launch vehicle. It has a very safe track record, very successful track record. It's considered as one of the cheapest and most reliable launch options available in the world. So a lot of European companies, European universities, which are looking to launch smaller satellites, like nano satellites, pico satellites, or cube satellites, which are meant mainly for research purposes, they rely on ISRO's PSLV to place them in orbit because it's a low-cost option for them. It's a cheaper option and reliable, safe, and efficient. So ISRO has launched multiple European satellites into orbit. Similarly, our heavier satellites, since India was struggling with cryogenic engines and GSLV Mark III rocket, we couldn't lift heavier payloads into orbit. Heavier communication satellites like the GSAT series of satellites, we couldn't place them in higher orbits, especially geostationary orbits. So we relied on European companies like Arianespace to carry out the launch of heavier Indian payloads into orbit. So that is the space cooperation that has existed between India and the European countries. Similarly, in the field of particle physics, in understanding the universe, the evolution of the universe, there's a lot of collaboration. For example, at CERN, where the Large Hadron Collider is located, right on the borders of France and Switzerland, you have this massive facility. It's a particle accelerator. It's meant to detect the God particle. It's a research on dark matter, which is looking to find the God particle, the Higgs boson particle, named after two researchers, Higgs and Bose, Satyendranath Bose from India, right? So Large Hadron Collider is a massive particle accelerator located at the CERN facility on the borders of France and Switzerland. So India is also a participant in the project. Indian institutions like BARC, the Bhabha Atomic Research Center, and TIFR, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. These are India's leading institutions in particle physics, in nuclear physics, etc. So these Indian institutions have contributed in funds, in technology, in resources to the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. We have Indian scientists working at these sites. But the biggest scientific collaboration between India and EU countries has to be the ITER project. This is the biggest scientific collaboration, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor Project. According to me, this is very, very important for your prelims because the technology behind it, that is nuclear fusion, has been making a lot of news recently. See, most of the nuclear reactors we have today, right, they're all based on nuclear fission. In nuclear fission, you're splitting the atom. Splitting the atom is much easier. The process is easier to control. All right. So all the nuclear energy we are generating, even on nuclear weapons, they're all based on nuclear fission. But nuclear fusion, where you fuse atoms, this is considered as the future of nuclear science. This is the reaction which happens in your stars, in the sun, and in all the stars in the universe. Nuclear fusion produces tremendous amounts of energy, and it's very, very hard to control. So humans are trying to master nuclear fusion, and if we are able to do that, we are going to solve the global energy problem. You can cut off and end your dependency on fossil fuels if we succeed in nuclear fusion. That is the potential of this research. And recently, there have been some positive developments. Those who are good in current affairs, those who have been reading newspapers will know what I'm talking about. Recently, there have been advances in successfully demonstrating nuclear fusion technology. So there's one experimental reactor in Europe called ITER project located in France at Cadarache. Cadarache is a place in southern France. This is a collaborative project between 7 entities: European Union, China, India, Japan, Russia, South Korea, and US. These 6 countries, along with European Union, are sponsoring this project. There are Indian scientists, Indian institutions, Indian companies involved in the ITER project. If this experiment were to succeed, if we were to master nuclear fusion, it will solve the global energy problem. It could be a solution to deal with climate change, to shift to cleaner energy. So it's one of the most high-profile projects where India and European Union are together involved in this initiative. That's why it's very, very important for your prelims. You will see similar collaboration in the domain of counterterrorism. You will see similar collaboration in the field of emerging technologies, emerging and critical technologies. such as artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, robotics. This is also another key area of collaboration in the scientific domain. In the defense and security domain, we have very, very close military relations today. As I told you, countering terrorism has become a common concern. Tackling Lashkar-e-Toiba, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State. This is a common concern, especially given Pakistan's role in sponsoring terrorism in the Afghanistan-Pakistan belt. Dealing with the situation in Afghanistan is a common concern. The destabilization in Afghanistan, the role of Taliban. This is a common concern. That's why we have very close intelligence cooperation. All right. We have procured a lot of weapon platforms from European countries. For example, we have procured the Scorpene, which is an advanced diesel-electric submarine. Does anyone know from which country have you procured the Scorpene? Can you guys let me know in the comments? From which country has India procured Scorpene? Very good. Chitra has got it right. The correct answer is France. All right. You would have heard about the Kalvari class of submarines, which Indian Navy has inducted. Right. It refers to the Scorpene project. France has transferred the technology to India, and all the Kalvari class submarines were indigenously produced in India at Mazagaon dock near Mumbai. They've been inducted into the Indian Navy. They are advanced diesel-electric submarines, which add to the potential of the Indian Navy. Next, we have procured the Hawk. It's an advanced trainer jet. It's an intermediate jet trainer. It is used to train fighter pilots. It's critical for the Indian Air Force to train our fighter pilots. Do you know from which country have you procured the Hawk? The United Kingdom. Very good. Radha has got it right. Hawk is a UK fighter jet. It's used usually for training purposes. So we procured this intermediate jet trainer, the Hawk fighter jet from the UK. Next, of course, the biggest deal of all, the Rafale fighter jet. I think everyone knows the answer. From France. This is the latest fighter jet we have procured. It has added to the muscle of the Indian Air Force. We have deployed the Rafales both against China and Pakistan. Right? It's one of the most advanced fighter jets currently in the arsenal of the Indian Air Force. Then Jaguar, again of British origin. Jaguar is of British origin. It's a very old aircraft, but still it plays a key role in the Indian Air Force because it's capable of delivering nuclear weapons. Jaguar is a deep penetration aircraft. It can fly very low, very close to the ground. It can evade radars, and hence it can breach the airspace of another country. So Jaguars, even though they're old fighter jets, they still play a key role for the Indian Air Force, as it can carry nuclear weapons and it can carry out deep penetration operations. Then comes the Mirage. Mirage is from France. The Mirage is still a major aircraft for the Indian Air Force. It was used in the Kargil conflict to carry out targeted precision bombings. During the recent Balkot airstrikes, when 12 Indian fighter jets penetrated Pakistani airspace, it was the Mirage which carried out the mission. This is of French origin again. So these are some key weapon platforms we have procured from European countries. All right. We have many important military exercises. Please remember the names of military exercises with key countries like France and UK. This is only for your prelims. Shakti, Varuna, and Garuda. These are exercises respectively with Army, Navy, and Air Force. Similarly, with UK, we have Ajaya Warrior, Konkan Shakti, and Indradhanush. I've arranged them in the order of Army exercise, Navy exercise, and Air Force exercise. Just remember the names of these important military exercises. There can be a prelims question here. We have such close military cooperation with them. We have signed logistics exchange agreement with France. We are aligning our Indo-Pacific policy as well with France, UK, even Germany is very interested. Italy has recently signed an agreement with India to collaborate in the Indo-Pacific. All these major European powers, these 4 European countries, they are playing a key role in the Indo-Pacific, and India is collaborating with them. Tackling piracy, for example, is a common objective, a military objective. To stabilize the Indian Ocean, to tackle piracy, it's a common objective of both the navies, so we collaborate together. And tackling every other form of offense, criminal offenses, organized crime, money laundering, terror financing. These have become common objectives. So there's a lot of collaboration between our law enforcement agencies as well. Drug trafficking, arms trafficking, money laundering. These are all major threats to our security as they're involved with terror financing. So there's a lot of collaboration in the security domain between Indian and European security agencies. But the centerpiece of the relationship is the trade relationship, the economic relationship. As I told you earlier, EU is India's largest trading partner if you consider EU as one trading region. Usually, China and US are the largest trading partners for India. If you take countries, if you take the whole region, EU is the largest trading partner for India. Our bilateral trade volume is more than $100 billion. Is that clear? We have a very big trading volume, a lot of exports and imports between both the sides, and India is the 9th largest trading partner for the European Union. So both are equally important. India is important for EU, EU is important for India, especially for Indian exports, especially for agriculture, textiles, pharmaceuticals, the MSME industry, engineering equipment, and of course the IT industry. All these industries from India are heavily dependent on the European market. It's a critical market for us. Even our financial sector, right, has a lot of dependency on European Union. We get a lot of investments from EU, and from India as well, there are a lot of investments in the EU. Many big Indian companies like the Tata Group, even Adani, Reliance, Infosys, TCS, right? They all have very big investments in Europe. We have created lakhs of jobs in Europe. Similarly, we get a lot of FDI and investments into our capital market from European countries as well. So the investments and the flow of goods and services, they are critical for both the sides. The flow of goods, services, and investments. That is why both the sides are considering a free trade agreement called BTIA. It's a proposed free trade agreement, broad-based trade and investment agreement. All right, that's the name given to the FTA between India and EU, which is currently under negotiation. But these negotiations have not progressed. They've not progressed well. They've hit a dead end because there are issues that have come up in the negotiations. Now, all you have to do is go back to our discussion on RCEP. If you guys remember, under RCEP, I clearly explained the divide between India and developed countries when it comes to signing an FTA. I told you developed countries expect very high standards of hygiene, sanitation, and phytosanitary standards. They expect very high biosafety standards. They expect very high, very strict IP laws. They expect very high environmental laws and labor laws. These are standards a developing country cannot meet. Is that clear? When it comes to foreign trade, there is always a difference between developed economies and developing economies. They expect very high standards of sanitation, hygiene, and phytosanitary measures. Developing countries like India can't enforce them. If we enforce them on our producers, our farmers, our industries will be hit. They won't be able to make those investments. Their production will be hit, their exports will take a hit. All right? That's why many times European countries, they reject Indian produce. If, let's say, Indian fruits like mangoes are sent from India, a large batch of it gets rejected as they don't meet the biosafety and hygiene standards. Indian drugs face the same problem. They get rejected. This is a standing issue that we have. We want the barriers to be brought down. We want tariff and non-tariff barriers both to be reduced so we can benefit from the free trade arrangement. Both sides can benefit. But European countries are not conceding. They have similar requirements for IP laws. They want very strict IP standards, very high environmental and labor codes to be implemented. But developing countries can't do that, right? That will place a huge cost on our domestic industries. It will harm our domestic competition. So we can't do that. That is why there is a difference of opinion, and as a result, there is a lack of progress on the free trade negotiation. All right? Even with regard to visa-related issues for Indian professionals and students, they are not making concessions. They are worried that if they liberalize the visa process, Indians will flood European countries. Right? It could increase illegal migration as well. Illegal migration is already a threat. European countries are receiving thousands and thousands of Indian illegal migrants. Countries like Austria, UK, right? They get a lot of Indian illegal migrants, thousands of them every year. That's why we are signing mobility partnership agreements with them. Mobility and migration partnership agreements with each European country. This will enable the legal movement of students and professionals while curbing illegal migration. This can become a foundation for signing the free trade agreement. In order to prepare for the free trade agreement, we are signing mobility migration partnership agreements with all European countries. We have signed it with UK, we have signed it with Austria, right? It helps them liberalize the movement of Indian students and professionals who are legitimately traveling to these countries, who have the right skills, who meet the eligibility criteria. It helps those countries to filter out illegal migrants and deport them to India. So see, these agreements are being signed so that we can facilitate migration between the two sides, and it can set the ground for signing the free trade agreement eventually. But as of now, the negotiations are stuck. There's no progress on the FTA front, but this is something India is really interested in. We are negotiating a parallel FTA with the UK. Since UK is no longer part of European Union, and UK is a major trading partner for India, we are negotiating a separate FTA with the United Kingdom. All right? And a separate FTA with European Union. So this is something you need to monitor in the coming days. You need to keep an eye on India-UK FTA negotiations, India-EU FTA negotiations. We are trying to revive this. Maybe since India is currently holding the G20 presidency, it might give India the opportunity to revamp the talks and maybe sign and finalize these agreements. Because last year we signed two major FTAs with Australia and UAE. So this year, or maybe within the next year, we might sign important FTAs with these European countries as well. So please monitor these topics in current affairs. All right? So this understanding is more than enough to answer a main question on India and European Union. Any question here will be based on the broad relations between India and EU, relations in the science and tech domain, relations in the security defense domain, and in the economic domain. This understanding is more than enough. You need not sit and separately study our ties with France, Germany, Italy, and UK. Those questions will not be asked by UPSC. In current affairs, if there are any factual topics related to our ties with these countries, then that could be relevant. But from the static point of view, this is more than enough. Don't go beyond this. You will waste your time. Understand the structure and the background of EU, as I explained, and India's ties with EU. That is more than sufficient. All right? Now, whatever questions you have, please bring it up. I'll take all your doubts at the end of the class. We come to the last topic for today, the United Nations, or UNO, the United Nations Organization. So let's cover this topic. It will take around maybe 35-40 minutes. So let's wrap it up. Keep your questions ready. I'll answer all your doubts at the end. All right? So let's understand what is the United Nations. Let's understand the background. That is very important for your prelims again. The structure of UN, the background, the objectives of UN. And finally, we should talk about India and UN. What has India contributed to the UN? Why is India demanding UN reforms? Right? These are some important analysis that we need to carry out. So as you know, United Nations is a global body. It's an international organization. It was founded in the year 1945, immediately after the Second World War. Today, it has 193 member states. Please remember the fact. And it's headquartered in New York City in the United States. It is governed by the UN Charter, which functions as the constitution of the UN. Just like Lisbon Treaty governs the European Union, the UN Charter governs the United Nations. So let's examine the background to the UN, why the UN was created, how the UN Charter was drafted. That is something you need to understand. See, when the First World War came to an end in 1918, a need was felt for an international organization which could help in resolving conflicts, which could help in establishing peace and stability in the world. Because World War I had caused a lot of devastation, destruction across Europe and around the world. To prevent such global wars, to prevent conflicts, to mediate between countries, to resolve common issues, the need for a global organization was felt, and under the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, the first international organization was created called the League of Nations. The first global level organization was created called League of Nations. This is something you'll study in world history again. The mandate of League of Nations was to prevent future conflicts. Its objective was to settle disputes peacefully, mediate settlements between hostile parties, and prevent wars from occurring. That was the primary goal of League of Nations. But as you all know, League of Nations was a failure. It was a spectacular failure. Instead of preventing conflicts, in many ways it contributed to the Second World War. All right? The League of Nations was dominated by the Allied powers, which had won the First World War. The Allied powers led by UK, France, US, all these Western countries, they dominated the League of Nations, misused it to humiliate Germany. In fact, Treaty of Versailles in itself is said to have contributed to the rise of extremism, right-wing extremism in Germany, that is Nazism, which was a fascist ideology. The right-wing fascist ideology rose to prominence, rose to power. Hitler could rise to power in Germany because of the humiliation the country had faced under the Treaty of Versailles and the way in which League of Nations was humiliating Germany. This became an excuse for right-wing extremists like Hitler, the Nazi party, to get the mass support, to target minorities like the Jews, and rise to power and establish the Axis powers, the evil Axis, led by Germany. So in many ways, League of Nations was seen as a failure because it actually contributed to more enmity. So as the Second World War happened, a need was felt to replace this organization and establish a new organization. The then US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, he proposed the idea of a United Nations. The term was first used by the US President in 1942 during the Second World War. He said once the war ends, we should establish such a powerful institution at a global level which can prevent and resolve such conflicts. So he used the word United Nations, where all nations will unite for a common purpose, which is to prevent wars and conflicts. Based on this idea, laid down by the US, laid down by Franklin Roosevelt, a conference was held at San Francisco in 1945, the UN Conference on International Organization. Please remember this point, very, very important. The UN Conference on International Organization took place in 1945 as the Second World War came to an end. Many countries participated in the conference. There were even Indian representatives at this conference. Even though India was not independent, under British India, Indian representatives were sent because it was obvious that India is about to become independent. So India was represented here. That's why India is seen as a founding member of the UN. So all these countries, all these representatives from around the world, they debated the structure, the role, the functions of the UN, the objectives of the UN, and they finally adopted the UN Charter. They drafted the UN Charter at the San Francisco Conference, and this became the constitution of the United Nations. This today is international law. The UN Charter is part of international law. It is obligatory on all the member states to abide by the UN Charter. All UN members have a legal obligation to abide by the UN Charter and its principles. All right, because you can become a member of the UN only if you adopt and ratify the UN Charter. So India, for example, has ratified, adopted the UN Charter. We have utmost respect for UN Charter. That is why we uphold international law, international rules. So when countries like China or Russia, when they break international laws and rules, they are criticized for breaching the UN Charter. According to UN Charter, a country cannot be hostile unnecessarily. That's why China is criticized for South China Sea dispute, the tensions it creates in South China Sea. It's against international law, it's against the provisions of UN Charter. China is unilaterally questioning the sovereignty of other countries. Same goes for Russia. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it was a violation of the UN Charter, violation of international law. Similarly, Western countries, they are no less. US, UK, they have broken the UN Charter multiple times. When they carried out the illegal invasion of Iraq on false intelligence, US and UK broke international law. They violated the UN Charter and its principles. Is that clear? So this document is the governing document of the UN. It provides for the establishment of the UN. It establishes the different organs of the UN and also lays out the objectives of the UN. This is what the Charter does. It establishes the UN, establishes the different organs of the UN, lays down the objectives and the processes. Please write down these points. UN Charter established the UN. It also established the primary organs, the principal organs of UN, which I'm going to explain very soon. It laid down the core objectives of UN. And finally, the processes of the UN. How resolutions will be tabled, what's the voting process, how the powers are divided between different organs. The roles of the different organs, they're all defined under the UN Charter. All right, how members can join, what actions can be taken against countries that don't abide with the Charter. All these provisions are contained in the UN Charter. So according to the UN Charter, the main objective of the UN is to maintain international peace and security. That is the primary purpose. That's why it was established in the first place. Right? It replaced the League of Nations to provide for international peace and stability, to prevent future wars from happening, to settle disputes, to mediate between countries. That is the primary role of the UN. Next, promoting human rights. Because during the World War, there were large-scale human rights violations. War crimes were committed, genocides were committed. So protecting and promoting human rights became a priority, and hence it's the second objective of the UN. Third, fostering socio-economic development. Because the two world wars had destroyed the global economy. Right? The global economy had been ravaged because of the World War. So now countries were focusing on the welfare model. Countries, they wanted to rebuild their economies, reconstruct their infrastructure. Socio-economic development became a priority because there was poverty, there were diseases everywhere, lack of education, lack of literacy, lack of healthcare. Solving these basic problems became the priority for the world. That is why the goal to foster socio-economic development was added. It's a welfare-oriented goal. Next, protecting the environment. Because industrial revolution and the world wars had caused massive pollution. For the first time, the environmental damage caused by human activities, by human industrial activities was being considered and taken into account. The industrial revolution contributed to a lot of emissions, a lot of pollution. The world war as well did the same. So finally, there was focus on environment protection. There was appreciation of the role of environment in human well-being. So protecting the environment became a core objective of the UN. That's why the climate change negotiations and all major conventions related to the protection of environment biodiversity, they're under the UN. And finally, providing humanitarian aid in case of famine, disasters, and armed conflict, mainly to help refugees. Because the world wars had created millions of refugees in the world, especially in the European continent. So helping them out on humanitarian grounds, giving them basic assistance, giving them medical aid, food, shelter, this became a priority and it was added as a goal of the UN. All right. So please remember these objectives. These are the primary objectives of the UN as listed by the UN Charter. Now to achieve these goals, 6 organs have been created. 6 primary organs have been set up. Just like European Union had 7 primary organs, there are 6 primary organs here. You have the UN General Assembly, UN Security Council, Economic and Social Council or ECOSOC, Trusteeship Council, International Court of Justice or ICJ, and the UN Secretariat. All these organs were established in 1945. When the UN was founded, parallelly all the principal organs were also established. All of them are headquartered at New York except for ICJ. ICJ is headquartered at The Hague in Netherlands. Apart from International Court of Justice, all the other organs are headquartered at New York. The UN General Assembly consists of all 193 member states. All the countries are represented here. Every country has an equal vote. This is the most democratic of all UN institutions. It truly represents all the countries in the world. Everybody has a representation. Everybody has a seat at the UNGA, and everyone has an equal vote, one single vote. So every year when the UNGA summit takes place in September, All countries get an equal voice to raise their issues, to bring up resolutions, right? And they all get to cast an equal vote. So ideally, you would assume that all power should be vested with this body, which is the most democratic of all, because every country has an equal right. But unfortunately, this is where the UN is flawed. This is where the structure of the UN itself is flawed, because the key powers have been vested with UN Security Council. In an elite body, in a body limited to few countries, only 15 countries are part of the UNSC. These extraordinary powers of the UN, especially those related to peace and security, they've all been vested with UNSC, not with UNGA. UNGA has no real powers. It has very limited powers. It can discuss an issue, debate an issue, come out with resolutions. But critical issues, critical decisions are left to UN Security Council. Within the UNSC, it's the P5 countries, the 5 permanent members, who enjoy tremendous powers because of their veto right. The 5 permanent members, I'm sure all of you know who they are. Supported 192 countries. This resolution can be defeated by just one permanent member, either US or China or UK or Russia or France. They can cast their veto and one country can defeat a globally supported resolution. This is the flaw, the critical flaw in the UN, in the very structure and the composition of the UN. The 10 non-permanent members, they are temporary. They are elected on a rotational basis. They're elected for a 2-year term. India has been a non-permanent member 8 times. Recently, from 2021 to 2022, India was a non-permanent member. We served the 8th term as a non-permanent member. But non-permanent members don't have any extraordinary powers. They don't have the veto. They can only sit in the discussions of the UNSC. They get to hold the presidency for 2 months, where they can set the agenda, bring up issues and resolutions, etc. But that's it. The powers are limited. As the chair of the UNSC, when you're holding the presidency of UNSC, you do get the flexibility to bring up key issues that are affecting your country or your interests. You do get the opportunity to bring up resolutions against certain important issues and set the agenda for the whole month. But however, the powers of non-permanent members is very restricted, very limited. All the powers are concentrated in the hands of the P5, the permanent 5 countries, which have the veto right. So this is the critical flaw of the UN. That's why India keeps saying that the UN is outdated. Its structure, its composition is outdated. It is stuck in the World War era. See, if you ask why only P5 countries were given the veto and why they were given permanent membership, at that point, these were the major powers of the world, right? They represented different parts of the world. There was always a geographical quota, geographical representation. For each region, so many seats were allocated. Of course, the victors of the World War, the Western countries, they had every say, they had every right to determine how the UN would be. So Western countries misused those powers to ensure that UN would favor Western interests. US, UK, France, they gave themselves a greater share. They got more representation. Whereas large countries like India were left out. Entire continents like Africa, South America were left out. Imagine the large continent of Africa has no seat at UNSC. South America has no representation. Middle East has no representation, right? But seats have been limited only to these global powers. This is the structural flaw, the critical flaw in the UN, where all powers are vested with UNSC. UNSC takes all the big decisions. For example, the right to impose economic sanctions lies with UN Security Council. The right to authorize use of force against a country, that is to invade a country if it is threatening international peace and stability, lies with UN Security Council. For example, when US invaded Afghanistan with a coalition force, it was approved by the UNSC. All right, this approval comes from UNSC. Then deployment of UN peacekeeping forces, administering the UN peacekeeping forces, deploying them for peacekeeping missions, is with UNSC. Countering terrorism, dealing with nuclear disarmament, dealing with all global conflicts, these critical powers related to security lies with UNSC. And P5 countries have complete control, and they are simply misusing their veto for their geopolitical interests. They're all driven by their own geopolitical interests. That's why at P5 there is a clear division. US, UK, and France, they are on one side. Russia and China are on the other side. All these countries are misusing the powers for their own geopolitical benefit. They're serving their own interests by misusing the UN. Is that clear? This is the critical flaw with the UN. The very structure, the very process of the UN is flawed because the powers are concentrated in the hands of the P5. All right? So this is what you need to know about UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council and why there is a critical flaw in the structure of the UN. Then coming to ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council. It is responsible for all the welfare policies of the UN. You would have heard about Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals. These goals they're set to eliminate poverty, to tackle hunger, illiteracy, to solve all the developmental problems. So Millennium Development Goals were implemented from 2000 to 2015. A set of global targets were set for all the countries, where UN and developed countries, they would assist the developing and poor countries to achieve these socio-economic welfare goals. Now the Millennium Development Goals have been replaced. They've been upgraded to the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. It's being implemented from 2015 to 2030. There are 17 goals identified, and today this is the focus of the UN. All countries are striving to achieve these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. It deals with urbanization, gender equality, climate change, pollution, disaster management, literacy, healthcare, education, international cooperation, hunger, poverty. All these developmental issues are addressed under SDG. So designing these policies, coming out with these goals and targets, assisting the poor countries, developing nations in achieving the goals. This is the role of ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. All right? Around 53 countries are part of it. They are elected. They are elected by UN General Assembly for a 3-year rotational term. Again, there is a geographical quota here. At every UN body, there is a geographical quota. There is a certain number of seats are reserved for different regions of the world. like few seats for Europe, few seats for Asia, few seats for the Pacific, few seats for Africa, North America, like that. There's a geographical representation at all the UN bodies, including at ECOSOC. All right. So around 53 members are there. They're elected by UN General Assembly for a 3-year rotational term. So it's like a policy-making body. It comes out with all your policy targets, welfare goals. It assists other countries, giving technical assistance, giving financial support if possible. So that is the role of ECOSOC. Next, you have Trusteeship Council. It no longer exists. It has stopped functioning today because its role was fulfilled. See, after the World War ended, there were few colonies, especially of Germany and other countries, which were not ready for independence. They were not fully prepared for self-rule and self-governance. So some territories, called trusteeship territories, they were directly governed by the UN. These trusteeship territories were placed directly under the administration of the UN to prepare them for independence and self-governance. So for a few years, for a few decades, there were many small islands and small colonies around the world which were directly administered and governed by the UN. They didn't have their own government. Slowly, they were prepared for independence, and today they've all become independent countries. So by 1994, all the trusteeship territories became independent nations. So there were no trusteeship territories to administer anymore. With that, the role of Trusteeship Council was completely fulfilled, and it stopped functioning. It does not exist anymore. Then you have ICJ, International Court of Justice. It basically resolves legal disputes between member states and also between UN bodies. If two countries have a dispute, they can approach ICJ. If two UN organs need legal advice, they can go to ICJ for legal advice. The orders of ICJ are legally binding. Please remember this point. Orders of ICJ are legally binding on the member countries as it's part of the UN Charter. India, Pakistan have filed many cases. They fought many cases at ICJ against each other. Pakistan has tried blocking our hydropower projects on the Indus River system. Right? We studied this under India-Pakistan relations. In all the cases, India has won. Recently, the Kulbhushan Jadhav case, where Indian national has been arrested in Pakistan, he's been alleged to be an Indian spy involved in terrorist activities. When he was given a death punishment, India approached ICJ and got a stay order from ICJ. So Pakistan is bound to follow that. Legally, it's bound to accept the order and follow the order. So ICJ rulings are legally binding on the member countries. Then finally, you have the UN Secretariat, which is the executive organ of the UN. It basically implements the policies of the UN. It assists the other organs of the UN in its functioning. It carries out the day-to-day functioning of the UN. All right, so that is the UN Secretariat, which is headed by the UN Secretary General. UN Secretary General is elected, but again, P5 countries play complete politics with the election. It's usually a Western-backed candidate who becomes the UN Secretary General. Western countries have such influence in UN General Assembly and UN Security Council. They always ensure their candidate, someone who represents Western interests, is elected as the UN Secretary General. This is a key position, and the Secretary General leads the UN Secretariat, the day-to-day functioning of the UN. Right? So it's usually a Western candidate who wins the seat, the position of the UN Secretary General. But the key problem here is the role, functions, and the division of powers between UNSC and UN General Assembly. This is the critical problem. The P5 countries have misused their powers, as we discussed. They've used it to fulfill their own selfish interests. That is why the UN is an ineffective body. See, many of you are asking questions from the beginning, from the very first class. Like, sir, why didn't UN intervene in Russia-Ukraine conflict? Why didn't UN prevent destabilization of Afghanistan? Why didn't UN intervene in the Kashmir conflict? The answer is UN is ineffective. Even if it tries to interfere, even if it tries to resolve the dispute in the conflict, it is useless because it's an outdated organization. The P5 countries misuse their powers to fulfill their own interests. What happened when we took the Kashmir issue to the UN? The Indian government placed faith in the UN initially, right? Because India had contributed to the establishment of the UN. We had hope, we had faith in the UN. So when the Nehru government took the Kashmir issue to UN, India was betrayed. We saw that countries like UK, which had a veto, they were favoring Pakistan. They were clearly displaying a bias against India, and UN was essentially being politicized. That is when India lost faith in the UN. We realized that UN cannot achieve anything substantial, especially when it comes to geopolitical issues. UN is a useless body. Look at the pandemic. The UN couldn't do anything. It didn't play any constructive role during the pandemic. During the Russia-Ukraine war, during all the conflicts you see in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, UN has been practically useless. Why? Because geopolitics has taken over and P5 countries are to be blamed. All right? But despite this, the UN has some significance, especially with regard to welfare, with regard to development, with regard to environmental issues, human rights, disaster management, refugee protection. In these areas, the UN still remains relevant. It still performs a critical function. That is why India works very closely with the UN. We have contributed immensely to the UN. Is that clear? Since it plays a key role in welfare issues, development issues, human rights, disaster management, etc., we still work very closely with the UN because of this reason. But we are opposed to the misuse of UN and its politicization. That is why India is pushing for UN reforms. All right? See, India has contributed immensely. We were part of the UN conference in San Francisco. We played a role in drafting the UN Charter, in adopting the UN Charter, and we committed to uphold the UN Charter. Since then, we have firmly remained committed to the principles of the UN. We have upheld international law. We respect international decolonization and standing up against apartheid, racial abuse, especially in 1950s, 1960s. When many African countries were going through decolonization, India gave direct support to them. We helped in introducing democracy, in pushing these countries towards independence. We backed their freedom struggle against colonial rule. When racial abuse became the norm in countries like South Africa, we backed the apartheid, the anti-apartheid movement. We opposed any racial discrimination and segregation. Right? So we've taken this firm commitment. We championed the ideology of non-alignment, which is in line with the principles of UN. We tried preventing an arms race and further conflict and a third world war by creating a new path, a third path, that is the non-aligned path. This in itself is India's contribution to the objectives of the UN. We supported the independence of all these colonies. We spoke up against racial discrimination and apartheid practices, and we became a leader of South-South countries. India promoted South-South cooperation. We have successfully used the platform to establish our leadership position in leading groupings such as G77. G77 is a grouping of least developed countries, developing and underdeveloped countries. India has emerged as a leader of such groups, and we are promoting South-South cooperation. We are promoting cooperation between the global south countries, the developing and underdeveloped countries. That is why UN remains relevant for us. We have many important initiatives here. Take, for example, the Climate Change Convention. India has played a positive role in working out the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. We actively participate in the Convention on Biological Diversity, follow those commitments, we implement those commitments. We have taken up the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction to create a global standard for disaster management. So like this, there are many more examples. There are so many conventions, so many treaties. The UN clause is one such example. UN Convention on Law of the Sea. India always abides by these UN conventions and treaties because it represents international rules. We respect, we uphold the international order because that is what gives you stability in the world. That's why when China breaks international rules, we oppose it, because that is a breakdown of international law and order. It's a violation of the UN Charter. We've also played a critical role in promoting multilateralism, in promoting multilateral institutions, multilateral cooperation on key issues like tackling piracy, promoting nuclear disarmament, promoting peace. We are the biggest contributor, one of the biggest troop contributing countries to UN peacekeeping forces. India is the biggest troop contributing country to UN peacekeeping forces. We have contributed more than 2 lakh troops in the last few decades. We have lost around 177 Indian soldiers in these UN peacekeeping missions. But you know what the irony is? The irony is, even though we are the biggest troop contributing country, we have no say. We have no control on how the UN forces are deployed. We have no control over their safety, their protection. We have lost 177 Indian soldiers. We have deployed 2 lakh plus Indian soldiers in various peacekeeping missions, and yet we don't control their deployment and safety. Who controls them? UN Security Council, the P5 countries. They have full powers on the deployment of UN peacekeeping forces. This is one more point that we have raised. Troop contributing countries should be given a say in how the peacekeeping forces will be deployed, how they will be protected. This is one more reason why we are pushing for UN reforms. All right? So we have made a big contribution, a positive contribution to the UN. We strictly abide by the climate change commitments and all environmental treaties and conventions. We have even proposed a convention against terrorism, the CCIT convention. We'll study more about this in internal security. India proposed the Convention on International Terrorism, Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism. It mainly targets state-sponsored terrorism. It seeks to eliminate state sponsorship of terrorism and call for global cooperation to end terror sanctuaries and safe havens and tackle terror financing and terror funding. But this convention, unfortunately, has not got global support. Most countries have not supported it, but it is a positive initiative of India to use the UN platform for something good. Similarly, we have used 1267 Sanctions Committee to target terrorists like Masood Azhar, which we studied under India, Pakistan, and India, China. I explained how China has blocked India's efforts to designate Pakistani terrorists to the 1267 Sanctions Committee. We have taken so many efforts to counter terrorism. We have even promoted nuclear disarmament. We have promoted the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan. It was proposed by then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi to provide for a global nuclear disarmament. But global support has been missing because P5 countries, they don't want to give up their control over nuclear weapons. They benefit from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and they want to retain their nuclear weapons. So they're not in favor of nuclear disarmament, and again, India's efforts have been derailed. Then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi had proposed a uniform and equitable plan to disarm all nations from nuclear weapons. This would have been a fair disarmament, which would have led us to a nuclear-free world. But the convention has not been supported, just like we haven't got support for the CCIT convention. All right? We even set up the UN Democracy Fund in 2005 under then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. UN Democracy Fund was set up to promote democratic institutions in other countries, to help new countries to transition towards democracy. So that is the contribution of India. We have taken a lot of refugees, protected human rights, and during the recent term, as a non-permanent member of UNSC, the Modi government also took many proactive and positive steps. We brought up a resolution on Afghanistan, which led to restrictions on the Taliban. This UN resolution, which was initiated by India, it placed restrictions on Taliban, prohibiting Taliban from supporting any terror groups on Afghan soil. We brought up a resolution for protecting UN peacekeeping forces, and we have even developed a software called Unite Aware, which we have gifted to the UN peacekeeping forces. It's a software tool that India has developed. We have gifted this to UN peacekeeping forces. It will help them in understanding the situation where they're deployed. It will help them in understanding the risk and the threats, thereby helping in protecting UN peacekeeping forces. We brought up a debate on maritime security with focus on China, South China Sea dispute, and UN clause. All right? We are focused on climate change convention. So India took a lot of positive steps when India was a non-permanent member and we held the presidency of UNSC for 2 months. But the most important point is that on the question of Russia, we have abstained from all the votes. This is where we need to be practical as well. As I explained in the previous chapter, to protect our important relations with Russia, we have abstained from all the votes. We have not criticized Russia. That is how we are striking a balance to protect our interests. But nevertheless, India has played a very big role, a positive role in furthering the goals and objectives of UN. Right? More than any other country, India has played a very positive role in helping the UN achieve some of its objectives at least. But our biggest problem is with the politicization of UN, the limited representation of UNSC, and how the P5 countries hold on to veto. This is the biggest problem for India. That is why we are pushing for UN reforms. We are seeking a permanent seat at the Security Council. We want an expansion of UNSC. The G4 countries, which we studied in a previous chapter, that's Brazil, Germany, Japan, and India. These 4 countries, they are claiming permanent seat. They are seen as legitimate claimants for a permanent seat. We have even got verbal support from US, from Russia, from UK and France. These 4 countries have at least given verbal support for UN reforms. But China is completely opposed. We are seeking a permanent seat at the Security Council. Yeah. These 4 countries, they are claiming permanent seat. They are seen as legitimate claimants for a permanent seat. We have even got verbal support from US, from Russia, from UK and France. These 4 countries have at least given verbal support for UN reforms. But China is completely opposed to UN reforms. See, the P5 countries are not truly interested in reforming the UN. Why? Because why would they give up their powers? They know veto power is helping them. So they just give verbal support for the sake of it. Verbally, US President, Russian President, UK, France, they have repeatedly said India and G4 countries, they should become permanent members. This is just fake promises, verbal promises. They haven't taken up any concrete measures at the UN to make the reforms happen. Because see, for the reforms to happen, resolution should not just be supported by UN General Assembly, but more importantly, it should be supported by the P5 countries at UNSC. Is that clear? Without P5 countries approving it, UN reforms will not happen. Now, let's say we get support of 180 countries tomorrow. We bring a resolution at UNGA, majority countries will support us. Despite the special majority at UNGA, still UN reforms will not happen because the final approval lies with UNSC itself. UNSC itself has the powers for UN reforms, not UNGA. This is the critical flaw. The P5 countries essentially have to decide. Even if one country vetoes it, resolution will fail. And trust me, no P5 country is genuinely interested in reforming the UN because they don't want to share those powers. They know it's an exclusive power they have. It's helping them further their geopolitics. Why will they share it with other countries? That is why they have not started text-based negotiations. There have been no text-based negotiations, which is what India is pushing for. We want concrete discussions to happen on paper. Like, for example, let's say your manager promises you appraisal. He promises a hike verbally on phone. That will have no value unless it is given in writing. Unless you get the appraisal letter from the HR, it has no value. The verbal promises don't count. That is what is happening at the UN. The P5 countries, at least US, Russia, UK, France, they have given verbal support, but it does not amount to anything unless they start text-based negotiations. That will lead to some concrete proposal, and resolution will have to be adopted by both UNGA and UNSC. Even if you get the special support of UNGA, even if you get special majority here, UNSC requires the P5 members to vote. All P5 members have to support the UN reforms. Only then reforms will happen. That is why reforms have hit a dead end. It's hit a dead end. India is pushing for it along with the G4 countries. We are also facing opposition, as I discussed in a previous chapter, by the coffee club countries. The regional rivals of G4, like Pakistan, South Korea, Italy, Argentina. These are regional rivals of India, Brazil, Japan, and Germany. They are concerned about losing their influence if G4 countries become permanent members. So they have their own informal group at UN called Coffee Club to oppose the G4. So this is the reason why UN reforms are not taking place. Is that clear? So when we are pushing for UN reforms, it's not just about permanent seat. That's not the only question here. Just getting permanent seat alone will not reform the UN. There are other questions as well. The categories of membership. Why are you having permanent and non-permanent categories at UNSC? What's the point? This is under question. Why aren't real powers given to UNGA when it is the true democratic body? This is another question. Next, veto. Why veto right has been given only to 5 permanent members? This is another question being debated for UN reforms. The quota system, the geographical representation system is under criticism. As I told you, many regions, many countries get left behind because of the so-called quota system. In bigger bodies like ECOSOC, it is fine, where 53 countries are elected. In ICJ, 15 judges are elected. That is fine, where regional representation is given. But in UNSC, there are only 5 seats. And if you have geographical representation there, many regions of the world will get left out. That's why Africa, the largest continent, has no representation. South America has no seat, no permanent seat. So geographical quota itself is under criticism. It's under question. There's a discussion, a debate on whether regional representation should be retained. What should be the size of an enlarged UNSC? What should be the process, the methods of working between UNSC and UNGA? These are the critical questions that constitute the debate around UN reforms. I'm clarifying this because many of them have a wrong conception. They assume UN reforms is all about getting a permanent seat. It's not. Just by getting a permanent seat, you'll resolve nothing. All right? There are other important issues as well, such as categories of membership. Who will have veto? Why should there be a veto? Why not give an equal vote for everyone? What about geographical representation? What about the relations between UNGA and UNSC? All these are key questions which are part of the debate on UN reforms. All right? We are pushing for debates, but it's not taking place. Text-based negotiations have not started because P5 countries are resisting it. There is no progress on this front. At least in the short term, even in the medium term, you don't see UN being reformed anytime soon. All right? But India will keep pursuing this because we believe we should be a permanent member. We should be represented here. We have a genuine claim. We're the second most populous country. Very soon, we will become the most populous country in the world. We'll be one of the top 5 economies, right? So India has every right to claim a permanent seat here. But UN reforms is not getting any push because the P5 countries are blocking it. They don't want to share their powers with the other countries. All right? So it's like a dead end that we have hit. But we do keep repeating the demand every time. The G4 countries, they together give a diplomatic push. They get the support of other countries, especially from the South countries, from other developing, underdeveloped nations. We get some support and we are pushing for text-based negotiations to happen. All right? So as of now, there's no clarity whether UN will be reformed or not. As I told you, in the short to medium term, there is no solution. P5 countries, they will not give up their powers. Understood? So this is what you should know about the structure of UN, the role and functions, and India's equations with UN. This is more than enough on the static part of it. But from current affairs, you will have to focus on various treaties, conventions, and other organizations and bodies of the UN, which are in news over the last 1.5 years. This is something we will cover in current affairs. Through our webinars, through our various current affairs initiatives, we will help you cover all the other international bodies, various reports, treaties, conventions. There are hundreds of them. It's not part of your static syllabus. It's not possible to cover it in the static part. All right? And UPSC does not expect you to study all of them. It's practically impossible, right? So we need to pick and choose. We need to carefully select the important topics. So we do that based on current affairs. There are so many UN treaties and conventions. There are so many other UN bodies and specialized agencies and organs. So that is something we'll pick up from current affairs based on which topic is in news. All right? But from the static point of view, this is more than enough. The background of UN, the structure and role, and India's equation with UN, India's contribution, and India's push for UN reforms. If you understood this, this is more than sufficient. All right? So with this, I would like to bring my discussion on international relations to an end. Let's look at some questions, some doubts which are remaining, and after that,